Zoro is not who you think he is. Zoro is a side character which is quite problematic because the premise of the fandom is that Zoro is the loyal right-hand man, the number 2, the green damage dealer who yells "Santoryu" and then goes back to sleep, and to which I say, absolutely not. If anything, Zoro is the most dangerous variable in the entire endgame, and Oda has been quietly speed-running a god-tier myth arc under the disguise of guy who gets lost at 90 degrees. Because as far as raw setup goes, Zoro is a mess in the most suspicious way possible. His village? Literally named Shimotsuki. The old guy who taught him to swing a sword, Shimotsuki Kozaburo, who we later learn illegally dipped out of Wano, forged Enma and Wado Ichimonji, and then just casually founded a village in the East Blue. That's not background flavor, that's a smuggled Wano colony with a child prodigy training in front of a grave. Whose grave? We'll get there. Here's an interesting thing. The fandom likes to compartmentalize Zoro. Lineage in one folder, cursed swords in another, missing eye in a third, King of Hell slapped on as a cool WWE title. This video's whole thesis is that those are not separate ideas. They're one continuous mythological through line that runs from Ryuma to Wano's guardian deity legends, all the way up to the very top of the world's hidden power system, including the people who literally sit above the Gorosei. We're going to be pulling on every loose thread, possible Shimotsuki bloodline and lost daimyo status, on the table. The cursed sword lineage from Sandai Kitetsu to Enma, and whether Zoro is actually a sword tamer being trained to forge the second true black blade in history. Absolutely. Hidden Conqueror parallels with Ryuma and these vague guardian deity stories that keep popping up around Wano. That too. One-eyed symbolism that lines him up with Odin, Mihawk's hawk eyes, and even the way Imu's eye is framed. Yeah, we're going there, and I want to emphasize that none of this is just cool trivia. The plan is a full 2-hour deep dive into obscure lore, SBS crumbs, vivre card throwaways, weird panel compositions, and myth references that Oda probably assumed we wouldn't obsess over, to which I say, mistake. We're going to treat every offhand Kozaburo line and every Enma close-up like it's a Rosetta Stone. The tone is fast, a bit unhinged, and to be fair, we are absolutely willing to challenge the comfy Zoro is just Luffy's shadow narrative, because the central contrarian angle is this. The story treats Zoro less like a sidekick and more like a parallel to world-shaping figures. Ryuma, the sword god of Wano, Mihawk, the only confirmed Black Blade user, and potentially the guy Joy Boy might actually need as an executioner when the new world gets built. If that's true, it retroactively changes how we read almost every Zoro scene, from Thriller Bark to Rooftop Wano. And the key might be one tiny detail we've been walking past since East Blue, that grave in Shimotsuki village and its connection to a forgotten Wano clan. If that grave isn't what we think it is, Zoro's entire backstory might not be either. We'll circle back to that once we've laid the groundwork. How Oda hides endgame pieces in side characters. So to make sense of that grave, we kind of need to zoom out and look at how Oda plays 4D chess with side characters, because as far as One Piece structure goes, the main character actually isn't where the really dangerous lore lives. Think about who explains the world to us. It's not Luffy. Luffy is allergic to exposition. The big, reality-breaking information always comes from guys who are technically supporting. Rayleigh casually dropping that he watched history happen, that the ancient weapons are real, that Laugh Tale is a place you can just sail to. Whitebeard, in his dying TED Talk, confirming that once One Piece is found, the entire world order explodes into a great war. Clover and the O'Hara scholars, who get like half a chapter of screen time, straight up outlining the Void Century research pipeline before getting Buster called off the map. These are not protagonists. These are lore USB sticks walking around in human form. Here's an interesting thing. That pattern is way too consistent to be an accident. Roger himself only meaningfully exists to us through flashbacks and second-hand stories. But those fragments define the entire power system of the pirate era. Rayleigh tells us what Laugh Tale is. Whitebeard tells us what happens after we get there. Mihawk, another side guy, looks at pre-time skip Luffy, shrugs, and says, "Yeah, this kid is the one who will overturn the seas." That one line quietly recalibrates the whole series. So, when people say, "Zoro's just the swordsman, he can't be that important," to which I say, "Have you met Oda?" The moment the narrative frames you as not the main, you become the perfect place to stash nuclear lore without setting off alarms too early. And I want to emphasize how the manga visually cooperates with this. Zoro is constantly peeled away from the crew, solo confrontations with Mr. One, Kaku, Pika, training arcs where he disappears with Mihawk for 2 years, and we see nothing. Those weird spiritual or sword realm moments with Asura, with the breath of all things, with Enma literally trying to eat his haki. These scenes are quarantined. They don't compete with Luffy's spotlight, which means Oda can quietly run a parallel myth arc in the background. Zoro's story starts looking less like guy number 2 on the ship and more like a mythic hero's journey that got embedded inside someone else's manga. Sacred weapons. He has a matched set forged by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, the same guy who made Enma. Spiritual trials. He talks to death on Thriller Bark, bargains with a cursed sword in Logtown, becomes King of Hell in Wano. A destiny that predates Luffy? The village, the style, the swords are all waiting for him before Chapter 1. If we apply Oda's side character pattern to Zoro, suddenly his random East Blue origin, the name Shimotsuki slapped on a quiet village, and this very specific trio of swords stop feeling like flavor text and start looking like endgame scaffolding, which raises a bigger question. What kind of story needs that much setup around one swordsman? To answer that, we have to go back to Wano's past, a one-shot from before One Piece even existed, and a so-called sword god who looks suspiciously familiar. The Shimotsuki bombshell, everyone underrated. So here's the thing. Once you realize Zoro's backstory is basically an illegal Wano satellite project, Shimotsuki Village stops being generic starter town number 3 and turns into a lore crime scene. Because as far as Oda breadcrumbs go, this is him straight up leaving the whole loaf on the table. Let's recap the canon crumbs really fast. Zoro grows up in a place literally called Shimotsuki Village. His teacher, Koshiru, his childhood rival, Kuina, both confirmed Shimotsuki in the data books. And then Oda drops the SBS nuke. Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano 55 years ago, founded a village in the East Blue, and just casually forged Wado Ichimonji and Enma, 2 of the most important swords in the story. That means Zoro's starter blade and his big Wano power-up are from the same guy. That is not a coincidence. That's a pipeline. And I want to emphasize, this is not just a cute trivia detail like, oh wow, Sanji's eyebrows swirl the other way. If Zoro grows up in a village founded by a Wano samurai, trains in his dojo's style and inherits one of his swords, He is inside a direct Wano lineage system whether he likes it or not. Even if he's not blood-related, his entire mentality, his sword philosophy, his idea of what a swordsman even is, are all downstream of Wano culture. But then we hit the bloodline angle, and this is where people start going galaxy brain. The popular theory says Zoro isn't just spiritually Shimotsuki, he's literally a descendant, maybe of Kozaburo, maybe of Ushimaru, maybe of some lost daimyo offshoot that snuck out with Kozaburo's crew. And to be fair, Oda did not help by drawing Ushimaru to look like Zoro if you toggled the age slider to 45. Same jawline, same hair, same swordsman aura, even the same kind of quiet, stubborn dignity. You look at them side by side, and to which I say, that's not a resemblance, that's a copy-paste with a mustache. Narratively, this matters a lot. Wano is a story about erased clans, executed daimyo, and a stolen throne. Zoro showing up as just Luffy's swordsman friend is one thing. Zoro showing up as a returning heir of a displaced samurai line is something else entirely. It reframes his whole role in the arc. He's not just helping liberate a foreign land. He's unconsciously avenging his own people. Suddenly, his instant compatibility with Enma, his gravitation toward the country's traditions, even his King of Hell title feel like Wano remembering him as much as he's discovering it. Here's an interesting thing. Oda draws a very clear line between people who cosplay as samurai and people who are samurai. You've got Kinemon's fake retainer gag in Punk Hazard. You've got randos in the New World swinging katanas because it looks cool, but they don't get the full package. No inherited styles, no legendary blades, no deep clan ties. Zoro, on the other hand, has all three stacked on his character sheet. That's too dense to be surface-level aesthetic. So, if Zoro is genuinely tied to the Shimotsuki, maybe even to Wano's lost daimyo, what does that do to his spiritual inheritance from Ryuma, the sword god of Wano, dragon slayer and literal national deity who already shares his face from lost daimyo to demon swordsman? And here's where the fun starts, because once you plug Zoro into Wano's actual political tragedy, his whole guy who gets lost and cuts things routine starts looking like a fallen daimyo narrative that escaped into the wider world. Wano is basically a case study in how to delete an entire class of people. Orochi and Kaido don't just take power, they go out of their way to erase the old guard. Daimyo like Shimotsuki Ushimaru get executed or disappear, their retainers are hunted, and the survivors are either slaves, bandits, or, if you listen to the propaganda, ghost stories. By the time the story starts, the average Wano citizen talks about their own samurai like you'd talk about urban legends, the 9 red scabbards, time-traveling phantoms, Odin, a heretic. Whole clans are reduced to rumors and burned family crests. And into that vacuum walks Zoro, who the world has independently labeled a demon. People call him a monster in basically every arc. Luffy recruits him off a marine execution platform while he's literally tied up like a public menace. Enemies panic when they feel his killing intent. Allies are like, yeah, don't make eye contact with the guy doing push-ups with a building. In Wano specifically, Oda leans into it hard. Kimono, top knot, 1 sword at the hip, 2 on the back, wandering Ronin energy cranked to 11. Here's an interesting thing. The moments that define his Wano presence are staged like ghost stories. The scythe deflection against Killer. Zoro casually parries a Reaper-looking dude midair, steals his weapon, and turns the whole thing into a horror panel. His rooftop entrance with Luffy and Kid cutting through the beast pirate's ranks in a single slash, is framed like the arrival of a calamity. As far as the grunts are concerned, a demon just landed. But Wano doesn't treat its demons the way the rest of the world does. It mythologizes them. Ryuma becomes the literal sword god. The daimyo who resist Kaido become martyrs. The country clings to this idea that one day samurai from the past will return to free them. That's not just narrative fluff. It's a coping mechanism for a nation that watched its protectors be wiped out. So, when Zoro shows up wielding Wado Ichimonji and later Enma, both forged by Shimotsuki Kozaburo, and just casually participates in slaying a dragon-shaped emperor on a rooftop, that's not random. That's prophecy-coded behavior. I want to emphasize how weird it is that multiple Wano characters look at Zoro and go, "Ushimaru?" Kawamatsu literally notes the resemblance. The fox Onimaru reacts to him like a familiar presence. This isn't just anime characters look similar. It's Oda quietly slotting Zoro into the visual language of Wano's lost daimyo and guardian figures. So, if Zoro is descended from that erased line, his demon reputation outside Wano is basically a distorted echo of what Wano would call a guardian or avenger. To which I say, in a world run by celestial dragons, being called a demon is probably the highest compliment you can get. The world government brands threats as monsters. Wano turns those same figures into household gods. And to be fair, Oda has already given us the exact template for this fallen daimyo turned demon guardian archetype in one character who looks like Zoro, fights like Zoro, and is literally worshipped as a god. Ryuma isn't just a coincidence, he's the prototype. So next, we need to talk about how Oda ties Zoro to Ryuma not just by face but by myth, and what that does to the idea of Zoro as the future king of hell. Ryuma and Zoro, a reincarnation or a relay? Ryuma is what happens when Oda looks at Zoro and goes, "Okay, but what if this guy was literally a religion?" In Wano's history, he's the sword god, the samurai who cut down a dragon over the flower capital, turned his blade black, and became this half-mythic guardian whose grave and sword are treated like national holy sites. This is not just strong guy from the past. This is, if you touch his stuff, the country has a panic attack, which is why Thriller Bark is actually insane in retrospect. We meet Ryuma's zombified corpse stuffed with Brook's shadow, and Zoro fights him in this cramped, smoky rooftop duel. No flashbacks, no exposition dump, just two swordsmen testing each other. And after Zoro wins, Ryuma laughs, acknowledges him, and willingly hands over Shusui, Wano's national treasure, to some green-haired stranger from the East Blue. That's like Japan's sword of state being gifted to the tourist who beat you in kendo. Narratively, that's a giant red flare saying, this guy is not an outsider. Here's an interesting thing. Oda later confirms that the Ryuma from his one-shot monsters and the Ryuma in One Piece are the same guy. Same life, same dragon, same legend. And he goes further, saying Ryuma and Zoro share a deep connection. Not fun homage, not similar vibe, a deep connection. People love to respond with, it's just a cool parallel, to which I say, Oda does not casually link his literal sword god to the deuteragonist with that kind of language. So we get the reincarnation theory. Zoro looks like Ryuma, fights like Ryuma, is stoic like Ryuma, and also cuts a dragon, Kaido's dragon form, over Wano's capital. It's a one-to-one recreation of the legend. The idea is simple. Zoro is Ryuma reborn. And to be fair, that would neatly explain the visual parallels and why Wano's greatest treasure keeps gravitating toward him. But reincarnation in One Piece is kind of weird, right? This is a world with souls, yes, but they move through pretty grounded systems. Brook's Yomi Yomi, Big Mom's homies, Moria's shadows. We don't have a clean cycle of rebirth cosmology. Literal reincarnation starts to feel like we're importing a different fantasy series, because as far as the story's actual mechanics go, a relay of will fits better. Ryuma's legend passes down through his blade Shusui. That blade gets stolen, travels the world, and ends up in Zoro's hands. Later, Wano takes Shusui back and gives Zoro Enma instead, the other great sword from the same Shimotsuki line, forged by Kozaburo, who also made Wado Ichimonji. So Zoro is now carrying Ryuma's role, Ryuma's replacement, and Ryuma's forged lineage. It's not soul copy-paste, it's a spiritual baton pass. I want to emphasize how creepy that gets once you remember black blades are forged through battle, and Ryuma is the only guy we know who pulled it off before Mihawk. If Shusui was Stage 1 and Enma is Stage 2, then Zoro turning one of his swords black is Stage 3, a metaphysical upgrade that could actually surpass the sword god himself. And we haven't even added cursed swords or King of Hell imagery to this mess yet. Because once we fold in Kaitetsu, Conqueror's coating, and Zoro's missing eye, that quiet relay of will starts looking like a full-blown occult sword system that might end with Zoro cutting something way bigger than dragons. Bending-cursed swords aren't cursed the way you think. So when we start talking about Kitetsu and Enma and all these cursed blades, the usual take is these swords are evil RNG machines that delete your health bar. To which I say, that's a cute superstition, but it actually doesn't match what we see on screen at all. Canonically, yeah, the Kitetsu line is supposed to be a death flag in weapon form. The shopkeeper in Logetown is literally sweating just having Sandai Kitetsu in the room, talking about how every wielder dies horrible deaths, like the sword is out here filing insurance claims. Most swordsmen in universe treat it like a geisha banner you do not pull on. The reputation is, touch this thing, get deleted. But then Zoro walks in and does the most Zoro thing possible. Instead of backing away, he goes, "Cool, let's speed-run the curse," and throws the sword in the air, holding out his arm like a human crash test dummy. That's not just bravado. That's a guy betting his entire limb on his luck, and his will being heavier than the blade's supposed malice. And the wild part? The sword curves. It literally bends around his arm and lands safely, like it just went, "Yeah, okay, this one's mine." Here's an interesting thing. Once you watch that scene with Haki and willpower in mind, the curse stops looking like random bad luck and starts looking like rejection. Weak wielders get chewed up. Incompatible wielders get discarded. Zoro doesn't break the curse. He overpowers it so completely that Sandai Kitetsu has to align with him or get left behind. I want to emphasize, that's the first time we see a so-called cursed blade act less like a haunted object and more like a picky partner. And to be fair, the other dangerous swords follow the same pattern. Enma doesn't just grief its user for fun. It yanks Haki out uncontrollably if you can't regulate your own power. Shusui isn't treated as some evil relic. It's a national treasure with this crushing spiritual weight, a blade that amplifies presence so hard people feel it just being drawn. These aren't hexes, they're stress tests. They're like endgame gear locked behind a willpower requirement. So cursed swords start to look like high-risk, high-output conduits for will and Haki. In a scrub's hands, they drain you, break you, or drag you into situations you can't survive. In Zoro's hands, they don't corrupt him, they expose him. They show how far he's willing to push, how much haki he can pour in, how insane his compatibility is with blades that allegedly kill their masters. And as far as narrative stakes go, that's terrifying, because what does a fully synced Enma Kitetsu Zoro system even look like for anyone standing in his way? And if the curse is just compatibility turned up to 11, then look at Zoro's growing collection. Sandai Kitetsu, Shusui for a time, now Enma, all these heavy, temperamental blades orbiting one guy. That doesn't feel random. That feels like we're watching the world's most cursed talent scout slowly gather problem children swords, because he's the one freak who can tame them, or maybe not just tame, reform them. Which raises a bigger question we need to tackle next. What happens when the guy who tames cursed blades also starts turning them into black blades? Zoro the Sword Tamer, Sandai, Wano, and Enma. So when we say Zoro is a sword tamer, we're not just being cute. The guy is literally running a rehab center for problem blades, and the staff includes a dead girl's heirloom, a bargain bin cursed knife, and a legendary haki vacuum cleaner. Start with Wado Ichimonji. On paper, Wado is the normal one. It's not cursed. It's not a supreme grade flex. It's just a very good sword. But here's an interesting thing. Wado is actually the weirdest of the three because, as far as the sword world is concerned, Zoro is using it wrong. He builds his entire style and identity around holding this one blade in his mouth. That's not a standard school. That's a guy hard-coding a promise into his fighting style. Wado is Quina, his childhood, his dream, and his I will never fall again, all compressed into steel. It's not a cursed sword, but it's absolutely a burdened sword. I want to emphasize how wild that is. Most swordsmen inherit a style, and then pick swords that fit it. Zoro inherits a vow, and then mutates his body to fit the sword that symbolizes it. Wado is his moral anchor, the constant. No matter what other chaos rotates in and out of his hands, that white scabbard is always there, like his save file. Then we get Sandai Kitetsu, which is basically his first job as a curse counselor. This thing is a mass-produced kitetsu, infamous, supposedly kills its wielder, the whole doomed by fate package. Any reasonable person goes, maybe not. Zoro, to which I say, of course, yeets his arm into a death spiral and goes, if it wants to kill me, it can try. And the curse loses completely. He just adds it to the rotation like it's a convenience store purchase. That's the joke, but also the point. He normalizes an infamous blade. The curse doesn't warp Zoro. Zoro's will gets baked into the curse. And then Enma shows up like, what if your sword was a gotcha game that drained haki instead of money? Enma doesn't just feel dangerous. It actively yanks out more haki than Zoro means to use, ballooning his arm, forcing him to either adapt or pass out. Most people treat Enma as uncontrollable. Zoro treats it as an overclocked training device. He learns to regulate his output, to match Enma's demand without dying. That's not just compatibility. That's haki conditioning under extreme pressure. So each blade becomes a different axis of will. Wado is promise and identity. Sandai is defiance of fate and curses. Enma is haki mastery and spiritual growth. Put them together, and you don't just get 3 swords. You get a system for pushing swords past their supposed limits. And to be fair, that's exactly what black blades are described as. Swords permanently altered by their wielder's will. Mihawk's Yoru is the only confirmed one, forged through battle, not found. If Zoro can casually housebreak a Kitetsu and negotiate with Enma while never betraying Wado's legacy, what happens when that will stops being temporary coating and starts leaving a scar? At what point do these problem children stop being cursed or hungry and start becoming his black blades? And if he forges even one, why not all three? Black Blades, the missing manual. So if the cursed problem children are already halfway tamed, we kind of have to talk about the final evolution, Black Blades. Because as far as One Piece gear checks go, this is the exodia of swordsmanship. We're told, very calmly, that a black blade is forged through battle, and everyone in-universe just nods like that's a normal sentence and not a metaphysical war crime. Right now, we only have 2 confirmed specimens in the wild, Mihawk's Yoru and Ryuma's Shusui. Both are permanently black, not just hockey-coated cosplay. Shusui is literally a national treasure of Wano. Yoru is treated like a world treasure, and the narrative treats them with this almost mythical, do-not-touch-the-glass energy. You don't buy these. You don't even really inherit them. You survive them. Here's an interesting thing. Canon is very explicit that they were not forged black. The smith didn't just go, "Yeah, I'll take the matte obsidian finish, thanks." Oda has said they became black through battle, but the actual mechanism is this intentionally vague mess. Is it armament? Is it conquerors? Is it some weird Ryuma-only DLC? The story refuses to give us a clean flowchart, to which I say, of course, it's One Piece. The power system ships first, the manual gets patched in 15 years later. Mihawk gives us the closest thing to a tutorial in Wano. He straight up says that when a blade turns black, its rank increases. That is wild. That means a sword's grade is not a factory setting, it's a character arc. The evolution is swordsman-driven, not smith-driven. I want to emphasize how insane that is. The greatest swordsman in the world is telling us the meta, and it's basically grind EXP until your sword transcends metallurgy. So, the working idea is this. A black blade is the end result of relentless, overwhelming imposition of will and haki onto a single weapon until its very nature changes. You pour so much of yourself into the steel that it stops being a sword you hold and becomes a piece of your spirit that happens to be sharp. At that point, haki coating isn't temporary armor. The blade itself has been permanently rewritten. Now, plug Zoro into that. Enma is literally forcing him to dump way more haki than he wants, like a cursed gym machine that steals your credit card and maxes your subscription. If he masters that, he's going to be flooding his swords with more willpower, more often than almost anyone in history. That is Black Blade training on fast forward. Add Conqueror's coating on top, and you start to see why Wano keeps side-eyeing him like Ryuma 2.0. And if Ryuma and Mihawk each managed one black blade, what happens if Zoro does it 3 times? What does it mean if Wado, Enma, and even a lowly Kitetsu all get promoted into permanent extensions of the King of Hell's will? At that point, is he just Mihawk's successor, or something the final war is absolutely not balanced for? Enma, Hell, and the birth of the king. So when Zoro says King of Hell, that's not just him workshopping edgy merch branding. That title is basically printed on his sword's birth certificate. Enma isn't a random cool name. In Japanese mythology, Enma is literally Yama, the King of Hell, the judge of the dead who decides where your soul goes. Oda slaps that name on a blade, gives it to the guy who will later scream, "I'll become the King of Hell." And we're supposed to go, "Wow, what a fun coincidence." To which I say, no, you're a fun coincidence, because as far as mythological signaling goes, Enma is about as subtle as a buster call. The sword doesn't just cut, it judges. It drags out your haki uncontrollably, like it's trying to rip your life force out and see what you're really worth. If you're weak, it doesn't not suit you. It actively condemns you. You don't wield Enma, you survive it. And to be fair, that's exactly how Zoro describes the early days. His arm shriveling, haki dumping out like someone opened the faucet and snapped the handle. Here's an interesting thing. That behavior is basically a built-in trial by fire. Enma forces Zoro to live permanently on the edge of death by haki depletion. It's training him to exist in a state of sustained, overwhelming output that would kill normal people in seconds. That's not how a normal weapon behaves. That's a cursed training device for a future Hell King. You want to be Enma's rightful owner? Prove you can treat maximum output as your idle setting. Visually, Wano Zoro is the payoff of that system. The aura, the demonic face, the black, crackling haki flames around his blades, especially Enma, make him look less like a swordsman and more like a walking underworld verdict. When he finally declares himself the king of hell, it doesn't feel like a random power-up catchphrase. It reads like Enma crowning him. The sword is both weapon and coronation ceremony. Every swing is Enma going, yes, this is my guy, this is my judge. And then we remember Odin. Odin, the dancing sun god of Wano, the guy associated with boiling heat, open seas, and freedom, wielded Enma for years and never turned it black. Zoro, who's constantly framed with graves, demons, and death, is the one who feels thematically correct to complete the blade's journey. It's almost ironic. The bright hero carries the King of Hell's sword, but doesn't finish it. The Grim Reaper understudy from some illegal Wano colony in East Blue walks in and goes, yeah, I'll take it from here. I want to emphasize, this Hell King imagery isn't just edgy aesthetics. It plugs directly into his conqueror's haki, the guardian deity symbolism around Wano, and the possibility that Zoro's judgment role scales up to the entire world. If Luffy is Joy Boy bringing dawn, who swings the sword on the old world's final sentence? In the next section, we need to talk about gods, dragons, and why Wano might have accidentally raised its own executioner. Zoro's hidden conqueror, not a surprise, a payoff. So when Kaido looks at Zoro on the rooftop and goes, basically, oh, you can use conquerors too, that isn't Oda dropping a late DLC power-up. That's the story, cashing a check it's been writing since Whiskey Peak. Then we get the king fight, the explicit confirmation that Zoro's literally coating his blades in advanced conquerors, and people went, wow, fan service buff. To which I say, mate, you're a fan service buff, because as far as the text goes, the writing was on the wall from day one. Zoro walking through crowds, and everyone just shuts up. The Baroque Works agents freezing when he gets serious, Morgan's men collapsing under his stare. That's not just he's scary energy, that's baby's first Haoshoku. Add in the cursed sword gag, normal humans yeet Sandai Kitetsu across the room in terror, Zoro just tosses it in the air and lets fate decide. That's not luck, that's a will so overbearing it bullies probability. And here's an interesting thing. This is where Zoro's conquerors feels fundamentally different from Luffy's. Luffy walks into a room, and people get inspired, recruited, adopted. His conquerors is a beacon. It drags you into his orbit, even if you hate him. Zoro's is an executioner's hood. It doesn't invite, it judges. You either stand your ground, or you get erased from the scene like a background extra who asked for a pay raise. I want to emphasize that flavor difference actually matters for the Ryuma and guardian deity parallels. Ryuma in Monsters and Wano lore isn't a king with a court. He's a lone freak with a sword who accidentally becomes a god because he keeps slaying impossible threats. Wano remembers him as a protector, but it's a protector you whisper about, not one you hug. Zoro's King of Hell title plus Conqueror's coding is that same archetype scaled up, a solitary guardian whose job is to pass sentence on monsters, not host a tea party. Look at how Wano reacts to him. People see Zoro with Enma and immediately start talking in myth mode. Is this the samurai from the legends? Kawamatsu and Hyogoro don't treat him as just a strong foreigner. They talk like an old story walked in. Even King, a literal Lunarian, freaks out at the idea that this guy might forge a black blade mid-fight. In-universe, his conquerors isn't read as, oh cool, another Haoshoku user. It's read as the return of a sword god template they already know. And, to be fair, that sets up a crazy duality with Luffy. If Luffy is the sun god who brings dawn and liberates, what does it mean that his right hand is the king of hell whose will is built to punish and cut? In the final war, are we looking at a joy boy who opens every door, paired with an executioner who decides what has to stay dead? What kind of balance is Oda building when the light of the new world walks side by side with the conqueror who swings the last sword, Wano's guardian deity, and the shadow beside the sun? If Luffy is the guy who kicks the door open, Zoro is the guy standing behind him like a bouncer for reality, and Wano is the first arc that actually treats that dynamic like religion, not just party roles on a pirate ship, because as far as Wano is concerned, people aren't just people. They're walking myths with job descriptions. You've got Ryuma literally called the Sword God. You've got legends about a hero who once slew a dragon over the flower capital, and you've got the Kozuki clan talking about a figure who will bring dawn and lead the world into a new era. That's not just politics. That's a state-sponsored prophecy department. The shogun isn't just a ruler. He's supposed to be plugged into this mythic power grid. Luffy slides into that framework way too cleanly. Sun God Nika, the drumbeat of liberation, Joy Boy parallels, the whole I will bring the dawn thing basically tattooed on his forehead. He's light, he's freedom, he's rubber Jesus. When he hits Gear 5, the sky literally turns into a Looney Tunes worship service. So if he's the dawn, the question becomes, what job is left in the cosmology for the guy next to him? Here's an interesting thing. Zoro's entire aesthetic is the opposite. Demons, Ashura, Green Reaper aura. His ultimate title in Wano is King of Hell. He doesn't bring dawn. He shows up when the sun rises and goes, all right, who's not supposed to be here anymore? It's judgment, not liberation. When he cuts, it's always framed as cutting something that should have died a long time ago. Mr. One's steel body, Pika's stone fortress, Kaido's indestructible scales. He's the blade that trims the fat off the new world, and the rooftop fight turns that into a literal painting. On one side, Kaido and Big Mom, the bloated gods of the old era. On the other, Luffy laughing in the lightning like Nika, and Zoro standing beside him, swords drawn, veins popping, ready to die, just to land one dragon-killing slash. It's sun and shadow, Joy Boy, and the sword god's successor. The scene quietly says, the world isn't saved just by opening cages. Someone has to swing the guillotine on the systems that built them. Wano already has a template for that. Ryuma, the guardian deity who slayed a dragon and protected the country from the shadows. Oda retrofits that entire religion onto Zoro. Same silhouette as Monsters era Ryuma. Same country of origin via Shimotsuki village. Same sword lineage with Wado Ichimonji and Enma, both forged by Kozaburo. Zoro kills a dragon over the flower capital, unlocks Conqueror's Haki, and tames Enma, the sword that once scarred Kado. At that point, calling him just a strong swordsman is like calling Mihawk a guy with a slightly above-average knife. And to be fair, that guardian role doesn't feel local anymore. Ryuma guarded Wano. Zoro is being framed as the blade that will guard the coming era itself. He's the executioner of Joy Boy's promise. People say that's overreading, to which I say, Oda then gives him one eye, in a world where one-eyed gods, rulers, and monsters keep popping up. I want to emphasize how loaded that is, because once we start talking about Zoro's missing eye, this guardian deity thing stops being a vibe and starts looking like a full-on ritual sacrifice. The one-eyed swordsman, accident or archetype. So on the surface, the eye is explained, right? Time skip happens, Zoro disappears for 2 years with the world's sharpest murder bird, and he comes back looking like he lost a fight with a bread knife. The fanbook just kind of shrugs and says, yeah, it was training with Mihawk, don't worry about it. And to be fair, Oda has been asked directly how it happened, and basically speed-ran the conversation away like he was dodging a sniper, which is already suspicious, because as far as Oda trivia goes, this man will write a paragraph about how a random goat on Drum Island spends its weekends. But when it comes to how did your deuteragonist lose an eye, suddenly we're in witness protection. So we get the usual fandom split. Camp 1, it's just a cool scar. Stop galaxy braining it. Camp 2, no, the eye is sealed. It's a power-up. It'll open in the final war, and he'll literally delete a Gorosei. Camp 3 is like, it's Mihawk's eye transplanted, to which I say, mate, calm down. That's not surgery. That's fan fiction. But here's an interesting thing. Dismissing the eye as nothing is just as wild as saying it's a Sharingan. Oda is a pattern goblin. He loves repeating visual ideas until they start to feel mythic. One-eyed warriors are not a random aesthetic. They're an archetype. You've got Odin tossing an eye into a well for knowledge, Cyclopes who blur the line between monster and god, heroes who lose an eye as the price for seeing the other side. It's sacrifice. It's access. It's straddling 2 worlds. Does that sound at all like the guy trying to be the bridge between human swordsman and literal sword god Ryuma? Look at when the design shows up. Pre-time skip Zoro is already ridiculous, but he's still guy with 3 swords who gets lost a lot. Post-time skip, one eye closes, and suddenly he's walking the path toward black blades, casually flexing Conqueror's Haki, and calling himself the King of Hell, while swinging Enma, the blade that once sat in a literal underworld-themed grave. That's not less mythic. That's the exact moment he graduates from strong crewmate to half-step folklore creature. And his perception doesn't drop. It spikes. This is the dude casually sensing killer intent on Punk Hazard, tracking invisible gas, reading opponents' movements in a snowstorm. The loss never really functions as a handicap in the story. It feels like an initiation scar. He gives up conventional depth perception to gain narrative depth perception. Is that a little pretentious? Yes, but the manga keeps backing it up. I want to emphasize, Oda is quietly obsessed with eyes as symbols of power and surveillance. Mihawk's hawk eyes are framed like a targeting system for the entire Grand Line. Imu gets introduced with a single, looming eye-shot that feels more like a god peeking through a keyhole than a human ruler. Even panel compositions keep isolating single eyes in moments of judgment or resolve. Zoro's one-eyed design isn't an accident in that visual language. It's him being drafted into that same hierarchy of watchers and executioners. And the wild part? Zoro is just the most obvious piece. The deeper you go into One Piece's eye imagery, the more it starts to look like a quiet map of who gets to watch, who gets watched, and who gets to cut through that gaze entirely. Which is where Zoro's swords, and the people who forge them, start to matter a lot more than we've been treating them. Odin, Amu, Mihawk, the eye as a throne. And if eyes are a quiet map of power, then One Piece basically turns the pupil into a throne. Because as far as myth templates go, Oda didn't have to look very far. Odin, the Norse All-Father, literally yeets one of his own eyes into Mimir's well as payment. He gives up half his physical sight to drink from this cosmic knowledge fountain, and what he gets back is not a power-up beam or a new sword style, it's perspective. He sees more of the world's truth by choosing to see less of its surface. That's the classic one-eyed sovereign, king of the people who know too much. Here's an interesting thing. Zoro's eye loss happens off-screen, during the exact period where he's being broken down and rebuilt by Mihawk. We leave him as a stubborn East Blue gremlin with 3 swords and no idea how hockey works. We come back, and he's casually cutting ships, using observation and armament, and sitting on enough latent conquerors to scar Kaido. The missing eye lines up perfectly with the moment his fate stops being Guy chasing a title and starts being Guy the story keeps framing like a walking omen. Did he sacrifice sight? Or did he, Odin-style, trade something for a different kind of vision? And then we have Mihawk, the man with the least subtle branding in the series, hawk eyes. Those pupils are basically sniper scopes. His entire deal is perfect perception and surgical violence. He sees every opening, every fear, every hesitation. He's not just the world's strongest swordsman because of raw power. He's the benchmark of what it means to see the battlefield correctly. Zoro's dream is literally surpass the guy whose whole identity is vision, which is a really funny goal for someone who closes an eye and never explains it. On the other side of the board, you've got Imu. We don't even see their face. We get that single framed eye surrounded by flowers, watching the world through a wall of surveillance screens. That's not combat vision. That's God's eye, CCTV. It's the gaze of someone who sits above nations, erases islands, and treats history like a file directory. If Mihawk's eye is the duelist's throne, Imu's is the throne of the hidden administrator. So, One Piece quietly sets up an eye hierarchy. Mihawk's gaze is martial authority, Imu's is political and existential authority, and Zoro's shut eye is a refusal, a deliberate limitation. I want to emphasize how weird that is in a series where power usually means more beams, more colors, more open eyes. Zoro chooses to walk around half-blind, like he's narrowing his focus to a single path. Cut, judge, execute. People say, maybe it's just a cool scar, to which I say, sure, and the Void Century is just an old calendar. The story keeps escalating this eye symbolism while calling Zoro the future king of hell and tying him to Joy Boy's crew as their sword. So if Imu is the eye that watches and controls from above, what does it mean that Zoro walks the earth with one eye closed? What kind of judgment is he being trained to deliver? And on whose throne is that blade actually going to fall? Sight-sacrificed warrior. What did Zoro trade away? So let's talk about the eye, because at this point, treating it like a random workplace accident is kind of insane. One Piece is a series where a boat has a will and a hat is a religion, but sure, Zoro just oopsie-daisied his depth perception away. To which I say, mate, you're a rushed backstory. The eye isn't just damage, it's a receipt. It's the visible price tag for the role he's being pushed into. In myth-coded stories, losing an eye is basically a subscription fee for higher insight. Odin hangs himself on a tree, trades an eye, and gets wisdom. Prophets go blind, seers cover their eyes, it's a whole system. So when Oda times Zoro's injury to the 2-year training with Mihawk, the world's greatest hawk-eyed observer, that's not subtle. That's a narrative post-it note saying, something was traded here, even if the manga never shows the contract. Because as far as context goes, Zoro literally walks up to the man he swore to kill and says, "Train me." That's already a death of ego. Now imagine Mihawk, whose whole deal is ruthless precision, stripping away Zoro's old, messy, spin-the-swords-around self. The lost eye reads like the moment the unfocused brawler gets cut away, leaving only the blade. He's not a wild dog anymore. He's a weapon that chose its own whetstone. Here's an interesting thing. The eye never opens. Not in gags, not in reaction shots, nothing. Oda loves cheap jokes. If it were just a scar, we'd have had at least one surprise it works panel by now. That pushes us toward two options, sealed potential or controlled overflow. Maybe that's advanced observation that would fry his brain if it's on 24/7. Maybe it's a deeper link to his swords, the same way Enma forcibly drags out Haki. Or maybe it's purely thematic, Zoro choosing a narrower, deadlier path, willingly cutting off a whole field of view to walk a single line toward the world's strongest. And to be fair, that lines up disgustingly well with King of Hell. A King of Hell is not a chill guy. That's a judge who has traded away parts of normal humanity. An eye, a sense of balance, the ability to say no to a duel, to become a better executioner of fate. He doesn't need full sight, because his role isn't to see every possibility. It's to cut the one that matters. Joy Boy opens doors. Zoro closes them permanently. I want to emphasize, whether the eye ever opens is already kind of secondary. The damage is done symbolically. He walks around marked as someone who paid a price to stand in the same narrative weight class as gods, dragons, and whatever Emu is. The closed eye is a promise that when Judgment Day hits, he's not showing up as Luffy's quirky sidekick. He's showing up as the sword that ends things. So now we've built this Shimotsuki-linked, Ryuma-coded, cursed sword-taming, one-eyed King of Hell who might have traded sight for destiny. Cute? The real question is, where do you park a monster like that on the final board? Because next, we need to look at Mihawk, the Gorosei's blades, Emu's watching eye, and how Joy Boy's war actually makes use of its chosen executioner, Zoro's endgame seat at the table of gods. So if Luffy is out here auditioning to be Sun God HR, Zoro is the guy they call when someone needs to be removed, and the story has been quietly building his client list for the final saga. We all know the obvious endpoint, Zoro versus Mihawk. That's been tattooed on the series since Bharati. But here's an interesting thing. Early on, that duel reads like a simple career goal. World's strongest swordsman, please and thank you. Post Wano, post King of Hell. It starts looking less like a promotion and more like a ritual. Mihawk isn't just a boss fight. He's the last guardian of the old world's greatest blade, Yoru, and Zoro is the monster from the New Age who walks into that throne room and says, move. Because as far as generational handoffs go, this one is loaded. Mihawk is literally a walking black blade tutorial. Oda outright told us black blades are forged through battle, and Mihawk is the only guy who's actually finished the process. Zoro, with Enma chewing on his haki and Wado Ichimonji quietly judging him in the corner, is the unfinished draft. Their rematch isn't just about a title. It's about whether the King of Hell can surpass the perfected swordsman of the old era without breaking under the weight of his own power system. But if you think Mihawk is the final boss, to which I say, mate, you are a rushed system, because the real horror show is sitting in Mary Joy's. We've got at least one Gorosei with a ridiculous living demon blade situation, probably more, plus the teased Holy Knights, who are very likely the government's secret conqueror haki sword-swinging hit squad. These are not just strong guys. These are the physical extensions of Imu's will, the sharpest fangs of the world that erased an entire century. And to be fair, this is where Zoro's function snaps into focus. He's not just Luffy's bodyguard who gets lost. He's the specialized executioner of the sun god's will. Luffy breaks the chains, tears down flags, punches the sky. Zoro walks through the smoke and cuts down the specific monsters that the old world has invested everything into. Black blades, cursed weapons, maybe even a sword tied to an ancient weapon. Liberator and Executioner, Nika and King of Hell, working as a matched set. I want to emphasize how clean this is with Joy Boy's Great War. After one piece is found, you don't just need someone to start the party. You need someone to decide who doesn't walk out. Zoro's Conqueror's haki, his Shimotsuki and Ryuma echoes, his habit of literally being called a demon. This all screams judge and headsman. Imagine him clashing with a Gorosei whose blade is said to cut fate under the watching eye of Imu, while the world finally sees Mihawk's successor unleashed, and we're only sketching the outline here. Next, we're going to slow down this vague mess and actually map it. Mihawk's role in crowning a new King of Hell, the Gorosei's swords, and possible ancient weapon links, and how Imu's single eye might be staring straight at Zoro's closed one. Because as far as the final war is concerned, Zoro might be the last person in the world you want to underestimate, and we're about to explain exactly why. The Shimotsuki Rebellion that never ended. So if Zoro might secretly be the worst possible person to underestimate in the final war, we kind of have to ask, who built that monster in the first place? Because that guy did not just spawn in a random East Blue dojo like a create-a-character. Shimotsuki Village is framed like generic starter town, to which I say, mate, that's not a dojo, that's an off-the-books Wano embassy that never stopped being at war. Here's an interesting thing Oda just casually drops in an SBS. Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano illegally, sailed to East Blue, and founded a village. That's not a retired blacksmith going on a gap year. That is a high-level craftsman from a closed country defecting during the slow-motion train wreck of Orochi and Kaido taking power. As far as timing goes, it lines up suspiciously well with Wano's descent. The daimyo era collapses, Orochi consolidates, Kaido moves in, and one stubborn Shimotsuki basically says, "Cool, I'm going to clone our culture overseas and wait." So suddenly, Shimotsuki Village stops being somewhere in East Blue and becomes an intentional outpost, a sleeper cell, a place where exiled samurai raise kids under the assumption that one day someone will have to go back. And to be fair, that sounds dramatic, but look at how the village actually functions. The entire social ecosystem revolves around the dojo. Swordsmanship isn't a hobby. It's the main export. Kids are literally play-fighting with Bakken like they're in the flower capital, not the weakest sea. Zoro's childhood now reads like a diluted, exported Wano. Wooden swords from age 0. Brutal discipline, constant duels. The idea that a sword has a name and a will drilled into him by a weird old man who just so happens to have forged Enma and Wado Ichimonji. Even Quina's dream, becoming the strongest swordsman in the world, sounds like a half-remembered echo of a country that once worshipped a sword god. What little girl in random East Blue decides that? One growing up in the ghost of Wano, that's who. I want to emphasize how deep this goes. Zoro's core motivation looks personal. Promise to a dead friend. Surpass Mihawk. Standard shonen package. But when you overlay the Shimotsuki context, it starts looking like inherited muscle memory. The clan that produced Ryuma, the guy literally deified for slaying a dragon and protecting Wano, exports a village, trains kids in his image, and one of them just so happens to look like Ryuma, use his sword, awaken conquerors, and call himself King of Hell. Totally a coincidence, right? Because as far as missions go, World's Greatest Swordsman is a perfect civilian translation of restore the honor and power of the Shimotsuki line. Zoro doesn't have the full story. He has the distilled objective. The rebellion never ended. It just got outsourced to one very directionally challenged child. And the wild part? One tiny throwaway detail in Shimotsuki village all but proves he was being prepared for Wano long before he'd ever heard its name. Kozaburo's secret curriculum, training a future Wano savior. And that one tiny throwaway detail is an old guy on a porch talking about swords like they're house pets with anxiety disorders. Everybody treats Kozaburo's flashback as cute grandpa philosophy. Swords have personalities. They choose their wielders. Nice. Slap that on a Hot Topic t-shirt. But as far as Wano is concerned, that's not random wisdom. That's literally state-level sword doctrine being smuggled into the East Blue. This is a guy who forged Enma and Wado Ichimonji, casually leaking the operating manual for divine weapons to a foreign-born kid. Here's an interesting thing, the way he frames it. He doesn't say, "Swords are tools, don't die, kid." He says a sword can be a blade that protects, that the point of strength is to protect others, and that naming a sword is making a promise. That's Wano all over. Ryuma isn't just strong guy with sword. He's the sword god, whose blade is a national treasure. Black blades aren't just power-ups. They're the end state of a lifelong relationship between soul and steel. Oda literally said black blades are forged through battle, not found, which is just Kozaburo's lecture with extra steps. So when this man tells Zoro, if a sword is scary, it's because you're too weak, that sounds like tough love. But it's actually Black Blade Theory 101. You don't fear the sword, you overrule it. You impose your will so completely that the metal itself changes color. That is some wildly specific lore for a random village geezer to drop between cups of tea. And, to be fair, he doesn't give this curriculum to everyone. We never see the other dojo brats getting the swords choose their owner speech. We see Zoro, the kid who's challenging adults, training until he literally passes out, and radiating that I will be the world's greatest energy long before Luffy shows up. Did Kozaburo see Conqueror's haki in him? Maybe. The series later confirms Zoro has it, so retroactively it tracks. Old man Shimotsuki looks at this gremlin with two Bakken and goes, "Yeah, that's a future Wano problem solver," and quietly dials his difficulty up to 11. To which I say, That's why Zoro's growth curve is absurd even by One Piece standards. He's not just self-taught, he's running a secret Wano endgame build without knowing the patch notes. Kozaburo leaving Wano, forging Enma, founding a village, and dying in East Blue looks like an epilogue. It's not. It's the setup. He exports a legendary blade and a human successor. Enma makes it home first, like checked luggage. Zoro follows later, carry on. And I want to emphasize, only one of those has fully returned to Wano's level yet, because the real punchline is that Kozaburo's philosophy quietly explains why Zoro can juggle multiple cursed swords without losing himself. And the next piece of the plan is what those curses are actually training him to do. Zoro the Sword Tamer, why curses don't work on him. So when people say, Zoro's just reckless with cursed swords, to which I say, no, you're reckless for assuming the sword is in charge. Because as far as the story's concerned, Logtown already told us who's actually holding the leash. Rewatch that Sandai Kitetsu scene. This is a blade with a documented kill streak, a sword shop owner literally begging Zoro not to touch it, and Zoro goes, "Cool, let's bet my arm." That's not bravery. That's a workplace safety violation. He throws the sword, lets it fall toward his outstretched arm. And it curves. The curse blinks first. We treat this like Zoro's insane luck, but here's an interesting thing. Oda frames it visually like the sword choosing him. The steel flinches away from his body, like it recognizes a will that's actually more dangerous than the curse itself. And that pattern keeps repeating. Sandai Kitetsu, Shusui, Enma, that is 3 problem child blades in a row. One is notorious for killing its wielders. One is literally a stolen national treasure with a history of zombified war crimes. And one is a hockey vacuum cleaner that tries to turn your arm into beef jerky. Any normal human treats these like radioactive waste. Zoro equips them like new gym accessories. What's weird is that none of them corrupt him. Sandai doesn't drive him mad. Shusui doesn't twist his personality. Enma doesn't turn him into a mindless hockey hose. Instead, they stabilize. They start wild, then gradually sink to Zoro's rhythm. The power spike is real, but the personality shift is minimal. He gets more King of Hell branding, sure, but that was already in the package. So maybe cursed in One Piece isn't evil demon blade. It's too much personality for regular people. These are swords with their own hockey residue, their own grudges, their own vague sense of taste. And to be fair, if you hand that to some random East Blue pirate, yeah, it's going to eat them alive. But Zoro walks around with monstrous armament, awakened conquerors, and a death-embracing mentality that treats losing an arm as a fun coin toss. He's not resisting the curse. He's negotiating with it. I want to emphasize that's a different role. He's not a victim of cursed swords. He's a sword tamer. Sandai stops trying to kill him and just becomes the Red One. Shusui, which once belonged to Ryuma, calms down enough that Wano's ghosts basically accept him as a stand-in. Enma starts as an uncontrollable drain, and by the end of Wano, Zoro is the one deciding how much it gets to drink, and that sets up the really wild theory. Oda has already told us black blades are forged through battle, not found. Ryuma did it once. Zoro is on track to do it systematically, across multiple high-personality swords, by bending their nature toward his own ideals. If Enma started as a training device, it might end as something much scarier. A cursed blade, whose curse has been rewritten by Zoro himself. And if he can overwrite one sword's will, what happens when he starts cutting things that supposedly can't be cut? Enma's true test. Who's controlling whom? But to really see how far that rewrite can go, we have to talk about the drama queen of Zoro's arsenal, Enma. Because as far as cursed objects go, this thing is not subtle. The first time Zoro draws it, his arm literally shrivels like a Looney Tunes gag. The sword just slurps his haki out. No consent, no warm-up, nothing. People call Enma a training tool, to which I say, your dumbbell doesn't try to eat your soul if you miscount reps. Here's an interesting thing about that first usage. The way Oda draws it, Enma isn't just strong, it behaves like a demon trying to devour its host. The veins, the emaciation, the way Hiyori and Kawamatsu explain it as it forces out more haki than you intend, all line up with the name Enma, the king of the underworld in Japanese myth who judges and punishes the dead. The sword is basically asking, do you control your life force, or are you just a leaking battery I can drain? And then we track the progression. At first, Zoro is getting hard countered by his own arm. He swings once, his haki output goes haywire, and he has to consciously throttle it back just to function. That's not a power-up, that's a workplace safety violation. But bit by bit, he starts matching Enma's leak with his own will, learning to regulate the flow so he's not constantly on the verge of becoming a skeleton gag. By the time we hit the king fight, the visual language has flipped. Black lightning, demonic aura, the panel where his swords are screaming while he calmly says he's going to become the king of hell. Enma is no longer the one throwing a tantrum, it's responding. I want to emphasize this. If it were just a raw haki check, Kid could have picked it up and face-tanked his way through. But Enma belonged to Odin, and before that was forged by Kozaburo, the same guy who made Wado Ichimonji and left Wano because its ideals had rotted. This blade is carrying Wano's lost standard for what a great swordsman is supposed to be. The test isn't, do you have enough juice? It's, is your will ruthless and clear enough to command a king of hell's sword that once obeyed a man who scarred Kaido? And, to be fair, that's a much scarier bar. Once you see it that way, the future Black Blade thing stops being a vague power-up and starts looking like a final exam. Oda has already told us Black Blades are forged through battle, not found. Ryuma did it once. If Zoro turns Enma black, he's not just catching up to Odin, he's surpassing him in pure sword mastery and fully inheriting the Shimotsuki legacy Kozaburo smuggled into the East Blue. That's the kind of narrative move Oda probably does exactly once. And if a man who can tame Enma stands in front of the world government's own legendary blades, who do you actually expect to be doing the judging? Black Blades as history, rewritten in steel. And that's where Black Blades stop being a cool cosmetic skin and start being history textbooks written in violence. Mihawk spells it out back in Wano. Black Blades aren't found, they're made. That one line quietly nukes the idea that Yoru just dropped from the heavens as a legendary loot drop. When a blade turns black, its durability spikes permanently. You can coat a sword in armament for a moment? Sure. But this is different. This is like if your haki got tired of being temporary and decided to retire inside the steel. Fossilized haki. A lifetime of clashes, fear, resolve, all pressure cooked into the metal until the sword itself evolves. People like to hand-wave that as endgame power-up, to which I say, mate, if it was that simple, every New World mid-boss would be dual-wielding black katanas like they just cleared a raid. But as far as we actually know, we can count confirmed Black Blades on one hand, Yoru, Shusui, and a couple of vague, unnamed examples Oda has alluded to. That's it. For a world that throws around Heike like confetti in a war arc, that scarcity is loud. I want to emphasize what that means for the system. A black blade isn't just maxed armament, it's the sword's biography. Every scar, every near death, every moment the wielder refused to break gets recorded until the steel literally can't go back. And to be fair, that's way cooler than just plus 50 durability. Here's an interesting thing. Look at who owns Shusui. Ryuma, the sword god of Wano. This guy is so revered that an entire isolationist country treats his black blade like a national treasure, a holy relic, to the point that Gecko Moria stealing it is basically a religious crime. Shusui isn't just a weapon, it's Wano's myth condensed into one object. The story of the dragon he cut, the era he protected, the faith people placed in him, all of that is embedded in that black steel. You're not just touching a sword, you're touching a nation's memory. Now plug Zoro into that framework. Ryuma has one black blade. Mihawk has one black blade. These are once-in-a-generation monsters whose lives were intense enough to permanently rewrite a single sword. Zoro? He's walking around with 3 potential candidates, Wado Ichimonji, Enma, and Sandai Kitetsu, each with its own cursed inherited baggage. Oda has already framed Enma as the sword that cut Kaido, Wado as Quena's will, and Kitetsu as a death flag machine. If even 2 of those go black, that's unprecedented. If all 3 do, that's actually insane. Because as far as narrative escalation goes, that would make Zoro not just the next sword god, but a one-man revision of sword history. Each black blade would be a different chapter. Quina's dream fulfilled, Wano's trauma healed, the curse of Kitetsu tamed and weaponized. He stops being a guy swinging swords and becomes a moving archive of 3 separate legends. And if that's the destination, then his final clash with Mihawk stops being student versus master and turns into something much dumber and much cooler. A duel where their blades are still evolving mid-fight, black steel crashing against black steel, history itself trying to decide which legend gets written last. Mihawk's eyes versus Zoro's eye, the hawk and the closed gate. And if Mihawk is the final editor of that legend, then his most broken weapon might not even be Yoru. It might be his eyeballs, because as far as one-piece character design goes, Hawkeye Dracule Mihawk is hilariously on the nose. Yellow irises, razor pupils, that constant, unblinking death stare like he's permanently checking your hitbox and frame data. The story tells us he's the world's greatest swordsman, but his whole vibe screams walking observation hockey tutorial. He reads battlefields the way Robin reads poneglyphs, instantly, completely, and with just enough smugness that you kind of want to punch him. Here's an interesting thing. Oda doesn't actually show us Mihawk doing the classic observation hockey sparkle spam. No future sight goo, no radar lines, nothing. And to be fair, he doesn't need to, because the eyes already do the heavy lifting. The epithet, the animal motif, the way he tracks Luffy and Marineford like a sniper, all sell this idea that Mihawk's true power is sight. Not just seeing where you are, but seeing where you will be and where your ambition is trying to go. Now smash cut to post-time skip Zoro, who shows up looking like he lost a staring contest with a meat grinder. Closed left eye, big scar, zero explanation. For over a decade, the fandom has been a vague mess about this. Is it just an injury from training? Is he hiding a secret Sharingan? Did Oda forget to draw it one week and commit to the bit out of sheer stubbornness? People will say, It's probably just a cool scar. Stop overthinking it. To which I say, have you met us? I want to emphasize, Oda could have given Zoro any random training scar, but he specifically mirrors Mihawk's defining trait and then inverts it. Mihawk, eyes wide open, predatory, hyper-present. Zoro, one eye literally shut, like he's put a lid on something. That's where this theory kicks in. What if Mihawk actually taught Zoro a style or a haki discipline that requires closing an eye? Not because he can't see, but because he's learning to stop seeing in the normal way. Think of it as a gate. Most of the time Zoro is fighting with one door bolted shut, forcing him to refine his awareness, his killing intent, his control over cursed blades like Enma, all while under self-imposed limitation. Then, in the fight that actually matters, that gate opens, and for a brief window he perceives the world the way Mihawk does. Every trajectory, every will, every weak point sliced into neat little vectors. The important part is that this isn't a cheap anime eye beam. If Oda's building to a moment where Zoro opens that eye, it works best as the visible proof that Mihawk's training is complete, that Zoro has paid the cost to wield that level of perception, which raises the real question, what did he have to give up or seal away to gain that kind of sight? And does that price connect to myths that go way deeper than Mihawk himself? One-eyed gods and sight-sacrificed warriors. And if that sounds dramatic, good, because Oda basically looked at Zoro post-time skip and said, what if I just speed-run him straight to myth? That scar isn't just edgy character design, it plugs him into one of the oldest narrative cheats in human history, the one-eyed seeker who trades normal vision for a different kind of sight. So, quick trip to Norse mythology. Odin, top god, all-father, guy who literally speedruns being a lore YouTuber, rolls up to Mimir's well. This is the place where cosmic wisdom lives, right? And the price for a drink is one eyeball. Odin says, yeah, fair trade, rips out an eye, tosses it in, and walks away, half-blind, but upgraded with permanent, terrifying awareness. One-eyed from that point on, but he sees more than anyone else. That's the archetype. You lose physical sight to gain spiritual, prophetic, or cosmic insight. And it's not just Odin. Across myth and fiction, one-eyed or asymmetrically eyed characters almost always have a weird relationship with fate. Cyclopes who forge god-killing weapons, blind seers like Tiresias who can't see the road but can see the future, snipers and sharpshooters who close one eye, and suddenly the whole world collapses into a single kill line. Even in modern stories, the guy with the eye patch is either a cursed veteran, a secret mastermind, or both. They've stared at death long enough that death started blinking first. Here's an interesting thing. Zoro is already written like that before the scar. He's the dude who sleeps on the deck and then casually walks into near-death experiences like it's leg day. He trains to the point of self-destruction, begs Mihawk to push him further, and keeps stacking injuries that would end other series' protagonists. Post-time skip, he doesn't look like a standard shonen deuteragonist. He looks like someone who's already survived 3 final battles we never saw. He's 21 and has retired war hero energy. People say, maybe the eye is just for cool factor, to which I say, yes, it is cool. But Oda doesn't accidentally pick the most loaded visual trope in global storytelling, because as far as design language goes, a single shut eye screams, this person has paid a permanent price. Whether Zoro literally sacrificed it in some Mihawk ritual, or it's a self-imposed seal on a power he can't safely use, the coding is the same. He's a sight-sacrificed warrior, someone who has chosen a narrower, harsher way of seeing the world. And to be fair, that fits how he moves inside the crew. Everyone else is chasing dreams that open the world up. Zoro's dream is a grindstone that closes options off. He's the one who says, "If you waver, I'll cut you down." I want to emphasize how visually isolated he is, the only straw hat whose face reads like a walking death flag. Which raises a weird question. If Oda is playing with this one-eyed god archetype on Zoro, why does another, much older, one-eyed presence in One Piece feel like it's watching from above the story itself? Imu's eye and the hidden watchers of the world. So let's talk about the other one-eyed thing in this story that feels like it's staring at us from outside the panel borders, Imu's eye. When we first see it in Pangaea Castle, it's not just, "Oh, spooky eyeball." Oda literally frames it like a painting in a horror museum. One iris, dead center, filling the panel. Dark lashes, that reptilian focus. No body, no face, just this singular organ watching from the shadows of the empty throne room. The series stops, the camera zooms in, and you can almost feel Oda going, "This is the thing that's really looking at you." Because as far as visual priorities go, that eye gets treated like a final boss before we even know its name. The throne is supposed to be empty. The world government is supposed to be a neutral system. Instead, we get a literal, hidden watcher perched above the political stage, like the world's worst baby monitor. And here's an interesting thing. One Piece is quietly obsessed with single eyes and observation. The world government flag is slapped everywhere. The Marines have transponder snails on every wall. The CP agencies are basically walking CCTV. The Gorosei just sit there with those calm, unblinking gazes talking about erasing islands like they're deleting browser history. Information only flows one way, down from that top floor, filtered, censored, weaponized. People say Oda doesn't really do symbolism, to which I say, mate, the man drew a giant all-seeing eye in a secret castle room and then gave his deuteragonist one functioning eye and a job description of cut down anything in the way of the future. At some point, we are allowed to connect two dots without needing an SBS footnote. Zoro, post-time skip, is a one-eyed warrior standing next to the future pirate king. Imu is a one-eyed sovereign buried on the empty throne. One eye that watches to control the world. One eye that exists to cut through the world's lies and obstacles. Imu's gaze is vertical, top-down surveillance. Zoro's is horizontal, locked on the path in front of Luffy. One hoards information, the other literally doesn't care about information beyond point me at what needs to be sliced. And to be fair, we probably aren't getting some wild twist where Zoro is secretly biologically connected to Imu or opens his eye and shoots world government laser Wi-Fi. But I want to emphasize how clean the thematic clash is. The old world is defined by a hidden watcher that never risks its own body. The new era's champion swordsman is a sight-sacrificed fighter who's already traded depth perception for resolve. It's the difference between a god that sees everything and a human who chooses to see less so he can commit more. One Piece keeps asking, whose vision wins, the paranoid god camera or the guy who closes one eye and swings anyway? And if Zoro is being framed as the blade that will one day point at that eye in the sky before he can ever threaten the hidden watcher of the world, he has to surpass the current embodiment of sword supremacy, Dracul Mihawk. Why Zoro has to surpass Mihawk before the final war, which means, structurally, Mihawk isn't just a cool endgame flex fight. He's the narrative checkpoint you have to clear before the game even lets you load the final war cutscene. Because as far as Oda is concerned, Zoro without World's Strongest Swordsman is an unfinished save file. I want to emphasize how hard the story has hammered this. Zoro's promise to Kuina isn't framed as a childhood dream that he kind of remembers when it's convenient. From Baratie to Thriller Bark to Sabaody, Oda keeps restating it. Zoro becomes the greatest so that the guy he's following can become Pirate King. It's not, also, I'll do this side quest. It's literally the condition of his loyalty. If he can't reach that summit, what business does he have standing next to Joy Boy in the last war? And here's an interesting thing. The closer we get to the end, the more crowded the top of the sword food chain gets. We've got Saturn with his sword, a Gorosei lineup that looks like a cursed Wano tier list, Holy Knights hyped as some secret elite, and a probably sword-using emu who casually skewers a map. You really think Oda is throwing Zoro into that mess still carrying the narrative question mark of, but is he actually number one? People sometimes say, well, he could surpass Mihawk during the final war. That'd be dramatic. To which I say, that's actually terrible for his role. Because then every clash with a Gorosei or a Holy Knight becomes a warm-up exam he's technically underqualified for. We'd be watching him audition for the job while already fighting for the fate of the world. The whole point of the Mihawk duel is to certify him before that. Look at how Oda structures rivalries. Luffy doesn't fight Emu first. He fights Kaido, the strongest creature, as the Joy Boy qualifying exam. Sanji doesn't wait until the reverie fall out to unpack his Germa trauma. He resolves that in whole cake so he can walk into the political endgame as a chosen, not a victim. These are pre-boss clearances. Zoro versus Mihawk is the exact same system. Zoro surpassing Mihawk is Oda stamping in big red letters, "This is the man whose blades can now decide world history." And, to be fair, the story's been escalating to that since Ryuma. We already saw a sword god cut down a dragon and save Wano's honor in a one-shot that looks suspiciously like Zoro cosplay. Now we've got the guy wielding Kozaburo's twin masterpieces, coding them in Conquerors, walking around as King of Hell. If that guy walks into the final war still ranked number 2, the title itself starts to feel like a vague suggestion. So, the duel with Mihawk has to land first, not just as a personal milestone, but as a global reclassification. The world's strongest blade has changed hands. And once you say that out loud, you have to ask, what if Mihawk's world's strongest status was never just about strength, but about his relationship to the world government itself? Because if he's more plugged into that hidden power structure than we think, their fight might be way more politically loaded than anyone is ready for. Mihawk's missing backstory and the world government's blade. So if Mihawk's title might be political, suddenly that lonely guy on a coffin boat starts looking a lot less like a neutral raid boss and a lot more like a retired company man. Because as far as actual backstory goes, Mihawk is a black hole. We know more about Kaido's teenage depression arc than we do about how the greatest swordsman in the world even entered the game. Here's an interesting thing. Shanks, Kaido, Big Mom, even Whitebeard all have clear myth tracks. Rocks, Yonko ascensions, former crews, territories, childhood flashbacks. Mihawk, we get lives in a gothic mansion with monkeys and used to be a warlord. That's it. For a guy sitting at the absolute peak of a power system that Oda loves to over-explain, the silence is kind of deafening. Now, look at his relationship with the Marines. He's not loyal the way Doflamingo is entangled. He's not antagonistic like Hancock, and he's not clowning on them like Buggy. He shows up to Marineford when summoned, slices icebergs, trades casual banter with Sengoku-level figures, and then clocks out the moment it stops being interesting. It feels like someone who knows exactly how the system works and where the lines are, not some wild free agent. And to be fair, that fits his whole vibe. The guy who's already read the manual and decided which pages to ignore. So here's the theory. At some point, pre-series, Mihawk wasn't just a random prodigy. He was evaluated, maybe even cultivated, as the world government's ideal sword, the perfect, controllable benchmark. World's greatest swordsman as an officially sanctioned standard, the same way the warlords were an officially sanctioned pirate mess. People say, but Mihawk's a loner, he'd never be their dog. To which I say, you can work with a system without worshipping it. You can be their weapon until you decide you're done. I want to emphasize how neat that timing is. The warlord system gets dismantled, Mihawk immediately becomes a former warlord, and who suddenly steps into the spotlight, swinging absurd, named Blades, the Gorosei, Saturn with that bizarre beetle spear, the sword-wielding elders clearly coded as legendary fighters. It's like the government saying, fine, if the external symbol of order walks away, we'll internalize it. We'll be the Blades now. If that's true, then Mihawk is the last uncontested, world-approved ceiling for swordsmen. When Zoro beats him, he's not just surpassing his mentor, he's shattering the last clean metric the world government could point to and say, this is the top, this is our guy. The new greatest swordsman is a pirate first mate with cursed swords, conqueror's haki, and a self-declared title of King of Hell. That is not exactly HR-friendly branding. And once you remove that stable, government-aligned benchmark, what happens next? The only swords of order left are those Gorosei monsters, and whatever secret lineage of divine blades they're hiding. So when Zoro steps past Mihawk's shadow, what kind of nightmare sword users are waiting for him at the very top of the world? The Gorosei's blades, and the final swordsman gauntlet. And the nightmare answer is, the guys at the very top are also sword freaks. The world's final balance of power is basically being gatekept by a bunch of ancient grandpas who all decided, yeah, I'm going to bring a blade to the God War. Because as far as we can tell, at least 3 Gorosei are implied swordsmen. Saturn's got the classic Western saber vibe, thin and aristocratic, like a dueling weapon used to sign execution orders. The tall Gandhi-looking elder has that straight katana with a ring-shaped tsuba that screams ceremonial heirloom that's also murdered continents. And then you have the bald guy with the massive nodachi, which is just a war crime in sword form. These aren't mass-produced marine sabers. They look old, personal, and very, very intentional. And to be fair, Oda doesn't draw an ornate katana on a top-tier character by accident. We already know black blades are forged through battle, not found. Ryuma turned Shusui black. Mihawk turned Yoru black. You're telling me the dudes who've been running the world for centuries haven't been swinging those things long enough to do the same? It's not crazy to imagine at least one of those Gorosei blades is already a black blade, or worse, some primordial cursed sword that makes Kitetsu look like toy aisle merch. Here's an interesting thing. Each of these guys feels like a different philosophy with a health bar. The saber user as order through controlled violence. The Gandhi katana as tradition and divine right, the old samurai myth weaponized. the Nodachi as fear and overwhelming force, the literal big stick of world politics. You can almost see how their fighting styles would mirror that. One precise and rule-bound, one ritualistic and technique-heavy, one just trying to erase you from the map with raw, ugly power. So when Zoro fights them, it's not just swords clashing, it's value systems colliding. Remember, this is the kid who started by losing to a bandit girl in a village secretly founded by a Wano exile, then climbed his way up to decapitating dragons and cutting down a king who styled himself as a god's right hand. People say, "Isn't that too big a jump for a side character?" To which I say, mate, he's literally walking around with Enma, the blade that scarred Kaido, and calling himself King of Hell. I want to emphasize how stepwise this has been. Bandits and bounty hunters taught him survival. Baroque works and CP agents taught him assassination and deception. Warlords like Mihawk and Kuma taught him the gap between humans and monsters. Then King and the Onigashima raid turned him into a guy who can coat 3 swords in Conquerors and split the sky if he sneezes too hard. By the time he reaches Agorosei, he's probably forged at least 1 black blade, maybe Wado or Enma. At that point, the question stops being, can Zoro win, and becomes, what legend is he writing into the world's operating system with each swing? Does he cut down order itself? Does he slice through divine right and prove the age of gods is over? That's where the King of Hell title suddenly makes sense. You send the demon swordsman to drag godlike politicians off their thrones without needing him to be Joy Boy. And the terrifying part is that might not even be his final opponent. King of Hell, Zoro's title, as a narrative cheat code. So let's talk about the moment Zoro basically hacks the narrative by yelling his new job title at a Lunarian. When he tells King, "I'll become the King of Hell," that's not just a cool WWE entrance line. That's the exact second his hockey and sword style stop being scary swordsman guy and start feeling like a mythic function in the story's operating system. Because look at what happens around that declaration. He's bleeding out, bones broken, drug side effects kicking in, and instead of dying like a normal person, he casually unlocks Advanced Conqueror's coating, fuses it with his already insane armament, and rides Enma's cursed appetite like it's a training wheel. The aura changes. The black lightning, the demonic horn silhouette, the sheer pressure on the battlefield. It's Zoro turning his whole kit into a more terrifying form, and then slapping a title on it. So we know this isn't just Zoro, but stronger. Here's an interesting thing. Wano is absolutely drowning in religious imagery. We've got the underworld gates, the fire festival, Oni, Tengu, literal trips to hell under the capital, and sitting at the top of that stack is Ryuma, the sword god, treated like a guardian deity. Luffy, as Joy Boy, is framed with drums, sun motifs, and sky imagery. Zoro, by contrast, spends the arc in graveyards, fire, and Oni masks, dueling a winged celestial over a sea of magma. As far as visual language goes, that's the underworld counterpart being born in real time. So when he says King of Hell, it's not random edge. It plugs him into Wano's whole spiritual system as the guy who rules the fiery basement while Joy Boy dances on the roof. People will say, "Isn't that overreading a hype line?" To which I say, in the same arc where Luffy gets called the Warrior of Liberation, Zoro getting a divine-sounding title is probably not an accident. I want to emphasize how useful this is for Oda on a meta level. He needs Zoro on the same battlefield as gods, ancient weapons, and void century conspiracies, but he does not want 2 Joy Boys running around. So he gives Zoro a mythic, almost divine niche. Not the promised savior, but the sanctioned executioner. The guy whose conqueror's haki doesn't gather followers, it beheads monsters. And to be fair, what does he immediately do with that new title? He cuts down Kaido's right-hand man, a literal king, who fights with sunfire and near-invincible angel wings. King of Hell stops being flavor text once you look at Zoro's hit list. Demons, dragons, zombies, celestial dragons, attack dogs, and now a seraphic lunarian. His narrative role is basically delete false gods, exorcise cursed history, and clear the board so the dawn can actually arrive. Someone has to drag the old world's monsters into the dark and close the door. And if Wano already crowned one sword god in Ryuma, that makes this new underworld king sound a lot less like a random badass nickname and a lot more like the next step in a very specific, very dangerous succession. From sword god to king of hell, Ryuma's shadow over Zoro. So let's talk about the guy who did New Game Plus before the game even launched. Ryuma is what happens when Wano speedruns national mythology. He slays a dragon over the capital, gets branded Sword God, and his black blade Shusui is literally enshrined as a holy relic. That's not just strong samurai, that's congratulations, you are now a religion. And here's an interesting thing. Oda doesn't just tell us this in Wano, he makes us meet the corpse first. Thriller Bark takes this legendary guardian deity, digs him up, slaps a zombie sticker on him, and throws him at Zoro in what, at the time, looked like a fun Halloween side quest. But watch that fight again. It's weirdly respectful. No big speeches, no tragic flashback dump, just two swordsmen testing each other until Ryuma literally laughs, yields, and hands over Shusui. People used to say, it's just a mid-arc boss, to which I say, mid-arc bosses don't usually pass down national treasures with the vibe of a priest performing a rite. Ryuma burns up, Zoro walks away with the black blade, and Wano's god has quietly chosen an heir from some random East Blue nobody. Except he's not random, because as far as the lore is concerned, Shimotsuki Village is an illegal Wano export, and Zoro has been swinging Kozaburo's sword since day one. I want to emphasize how ceremonial that all looks in hindsight. First, Ryuma the sword god acknowledges Zoro's skill. Then, he gifts him the sword that symbolizes Wano's protection. Years later, Wano itself goes, actually, can we have our religious artifact back? And what does Zoro get instead? Enma. The blade that once scarred Kaido and literally drags your Heiki into the underworld if you're not careful. So we go from Sword God's Holy Black Blade to Hades' internship program. That's not a downgrade, that's a role change. Ryuma's title is calm, vertical, divine, God of the Sword, protector from above. Zoro's self-proclaimed title is horizontal and dirty, King of Hell. Not a serene guardian deity, but the guy who rules the pit and does the work the gods can't be seen doing. You want a dragon cut down over Wano? Call Ryuma. You want the old world order decapitated in a back alley at dawn? That's a Zoro problem. And to be fair, Oda is not subtle about the visual copy-paste. Monsters-era Ryuma already looks like Zoro's ancestor skin. Same face, same grin, same I will cut the impossible because it's funny energy. It's like the story is setting up two Shimotsuki legends on purpose. The god who defended Wano's closed borders in the past, and the Hell King who helps burn those borders, and the systems behind them, to ash. By the endgame, history books probably read like a before and after page. First panel, Ryuma, sword god of Wano, dragon corpse falling from the sky. Second panel, Zoro, king of hell, standing over the corpse of some uncuttable symbol of the world government. And the missing link between those two myths is Zoro's hidden conquerors, that quiet, I was always royalty energy finally going loud, which is where this whole guardian deity thing gets even stranger. Zoro, the hidden conqueror, not just a strong first mate. So let's talk about the moment the story basically looked at us and said, yes, your green swordsman is royalty. Stop pretending he's just the guy who gets lost. On the rooftop in Wano, Zoro clashes with Kaido. His blades crackle, the sky kind of screams, and Kaido just casually drops, "You too have Conqueror's haki." That's it. Years of debates, power-scaling charts, and forum wars wiped out in one drunk dragon sentence. People had been arguing forever that Zoro was just an elite fighter with armament and observation, to which I say, mate, you don't accidentally knock out half a live floor by being really enthusiastic. Conqueror's haki is not a gym membership perk. It's the narrative badge that says, this person shapes history. Roger, Whitebeard, Shanks, Luffy, these are not side characters. So when Oda quietly slides Zoro into that same category, he's updating Zoro's role in the system from best employee to guy who could start his own company and crash the market. Because as far as the series is concerned, Conquerors is less a power-up and more a personality diagnosis. You don't train it, you are it. It's that innate, era-bending stubbornness that says, the world will rearrange around my dream, not the other way around. And Zoro has always operated like that. From, I'll be the world's greatest swordsman or die at a random marine base, to tanking Luffy's pain at Thriller Bark like it's a mildly annoying tax, he's been broadcasting how Shoku energy long before the lightning effect showed up. Here's an interesting thing. Wano already has a template for this kind of guy, and his name is Ryuma. We never see Ryuma explicitly use haki, but the way Wano talks about him is exactly how the world talks about conquerors. Sword god, dragon slayer, a single man whose existence rewrote a country's mythology. That is conqueror framing. When the narrative mirrors Ryuma's legend with Zoro's King of Hell moment, it's basically saying, yeah, this is that again. Different era, same spiritual category. And to be fair, Oda could have left Zoro as the ultimate right-hand man, the Vegeta, the Rayleigh, the guy you respect but never confuse with the protagonist. Giving him Conqueror's haki breaks that mold on purpose. I want to emphasize this isn't just a late-game stat boost. It's Oda writing in big invisible letters. This man could have been the main character of his own manga, and it would still sell 500 million copies. That's why the Kaido line hits so hard. It retroactively reframes every Zoro moment, not as Luffy's dependable subordinate, but as a parallel king who chose to back another king. Which raises a very uncomfortable question for the story. How does a man with a king's will, a Hell King title, and one suspiciously sealed eye fit into Joy Boy's prophecy without accidentally eclipsing Luffy? And what exactly is Oda saving that last eye opening for? Zoro's place in Joy Boy's prophecy. So let's just rip the bandage off. Joy Boy is Luffy's story. He's the sun god, the drum solo, the meme face on the ancient prophecy. Zoro is never stealing that spotlight, and to which I say, good. Because as far as actual narrative load-bearing goes, a sun needs pillars, and Zoro is one of the biggest, angriest pillars Oda has ever drawn. Here's an interesting thing. When you look at Joy Boy's promise, the dawn of the world, and all that inherited will talk, it's all about liberation, dancing, drums, parties on giant trees. It's vibes. But to get to those vibes, someone has to cut through centuries of concrete, chains, and very well-armed old men. That's where Zoro comes in as the path cutter. Luffy doesn't have time to 1 versus 1 every obstacle. He's busy being a symbol. Zoro is the guy who walks ahead and says, "Which problem do you want deleted?" We've already seen the prototype. Kaido is Joy Boy's wall. King is the lock on that wall. Luffy breaks Kaido. Zoro breaks King. Wano is a closed tomb. Zoro literally slices open its skies and its dragon guardians. Scale that up, and you get the final saga. Gorosei swordsman, Imu's enforcers, maybe even some ancient weapon guard dog, all queued up for the same treatment. The idea isn't that Zoro competes with Joy Boy's destiny. He clears the queue so Joy Boy doesn't get bogged down in every duel like an MMO raid leader with no DPS. And to be fair, Oda has been sneakily building the perfect underworld enforcer for this. Shimotsuki Village is a Wano offshoot. Kozaburo forges both Wado and Enma, puts them in this kid's hands, and that kid grows into a conqueror whose haki literally terrifies King. Zoro masters cursed blades, the exact swords that eat weak wielders, and instead of dying, he bullies them into submission. Black blades are said to be forged through battle. Mihawk has one, Ryuma had one, and Zoro is walking around with a starter kit and a body count. Now add the one-eyed thing. People joke that he just slipped while training, to which I say, sure. And Shanks just tripped into losing his arm to a goldfish. One-eyed warriors in myth sacrifice sight for insight. Zoro closes one eye, opens to Conqueror's coating, Asura, king of hell. It kind of tracks that the swordsman who'll escort the sun into a new era is visually coded as half in light, half in shadow. I want to emphasize this. Joy Boy has to remain a symbol of freedom, joy, and possibility. He can't be the guy we associate with executions, god-slaying, and cutting down the last sacred guardians of the old world order. History needs a shadow for that. So the final books tell you about the sun that rose, Nika, Joy Boy, Luffy, but the whispered stories talk about the silhouette with one eye and 3 blades that carved that sunrise out of the world's darkest night. And if that's the role, then each of Zoro's swords is basically a contract for a different piece of that job, which is where we're headed next, because those blades are quietly writing his ending for him, the one-eyed problem, why Zoro's scar makes no sense in world. And speaking of contracts, we need to talk about the most cursed one of all, the deal Oda made with Zoro's left eye to just never explain it. Because as far as in-world logic goes, that scar is actually one of the biggest unsolved lore problems in the entire series. Basic timeline: Zoro leaves for training with Mihawk at Sabayori with 2 perfectly functional eyes. 2 years later, he strolls back in on the Sunny like a green-haired Mihawk cosplayer. One eye permanently shut, giant scar crossing it, 0 on-panel flashback, 0 in-story explanation, and Oda dodging every question in SBS like he's speedrunning avoidance. People keep asking, so, what happened? And he basically goes, he trained very hard. To which I say, mate, that's not an answer. That's a vibes check. Here's an interesting thing. One Piece is usually very loud about major body damage. Shanks' arm? We literally watch him lose it to the Sea King to save Luffy. Luffy's chest scar? Front row seats at Marineford, courtesy of a Kainu. Kid's missing arm? Directly tied to his clash with the Red Hair Pirates, heavily implied and thematically loaded. Law's entire torso is a roadmap of trauma, and we see or are told why. Even little stuff like Zoro's early scars get battle context. But the eye? Nothing. It just exists, fully formed, like it time-skipped in from a different manga. And to be fair, you could say, it's just a cool design choice, relax. But this is the same author who turned Luffy's little X-Scar into a permanent reminder of Ace and Marineford, and who made Shank's missing arm the literal catalyst for the Pirate King Dream's transfer. Oda ties big visual changes to big emotional beats. Zoro's eye gets a hard cut and a fashion upgrade, which is where eyes as symbols come in. In this series, eyes are basically narrative UI. Observation Haki is visualized like Sharingan light awareness. Sanji spends the entire time skip with one eye covered, then swaps which eye is visible when his role shifts. Imu is introduced with a single staring eye in the shadows. Mihawk's hawk eyes are a visual shorthand for, this man sees the truth of the world and will cut you in half about it. Eyes in One Piece aren't just body parts. They're a language for perception, will, and power. So what if Zoro's closed eye is less damage and more deliberate restriction? Not, oops, Mihawk slipped, but a seal. A lid on some kind of perception, power, or killing intent that Zoro is not supposed to be using yet. The guy trains with the world's greatest swordsman, whose entire brand is literally vision, and walks away having voluntarily shut half of his own. That feels like a lesson, not an accident. Fan takes usually fall into 3 buckets. Mihawk slashed him in training, random training mishap, or pure design choice. I want to emphasize how shallow those feel compared to how Oda normally operates. If Mihawk scarred him as a teaching moment, that is prime flashback fodder. If it was a tragic accident, that's instant character drama. If it's only aesthetic, why wrap it in mystery for over a decade while giving SBS essays about, like, how Foxy's nose works? The more consistent read is that the eye is a narrative check engine light, a sealed conqueror's Haki mode he can't fully control yet, a limiter for how much cursed sword will he can channel without losing himself, or, pulling from Wano's own spiritual language, a kind of Odin-style sacrifice of sight for insight, closing one eye to better see the world's strongest swordsman path. And if that's true, then the day that eye opens, if it ever does, isn't just a cosmetic toggle. It's Zoro taking the governor off his entire system, which gets a lot more interesting once we start pairing that eye with specific blades and what they're actually doing to him. Odin, one-eyed gods, and why Zoro might be a sight-sacrificed warrior. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, or I guess the missing elephant, because Zoro's eye has been shut for over a decade, and Oda has treated it like Voldemort's tax records. It exists, we all know it's important, and nobody's allowed to look at it directly. Here's an interesting thing. In mythology, one-eyed guys are almost never just dudes who had a bad day. The poster child is Odin, the All-Father from Norse myth. He doesn't lose an eye in some bar fight with a frost giant. He rips it out himself and dumps it in Mimir's well as payment. The deal is brutal but simple. Give up literal sight. Gain cosmic insight. 1 sense down. Universal Wi-Fi unlocked. That's not a war injury. That's a software upgrade. Now map that onto Zoro. We've already got the King of Hell thing, which is very chill and normal for a guy whose dream is beat the Hawkman. Odin is a warrior king who presides over the dead in Valhalla and chooses which souls get guided into his hall. Zoro, post-Wano, is literally framed walking out of the underworld, cutting king and queen down and dragging the beast pirate's morale into hell with him. He's not just a swordsman, He's acting like a psychopomp with AB definition. And to be fair, Zoro's whole brand is, I will endure any pain if it makes me stronger. Nothing happened at Thriller Bark is already an Odin tier self-sacrifice moment. So when we see him post-time skip with one eye closed, after 2 years of Mihawk's murder boot camp, we're supposed to think that's random? To which I say, Oda does not accidentally design a one-eyed, death-themed swordsman in a story that already plays with gods, because as far as mythic archetypes go, One Piece is a crowded mess on purpose. Sun god Nika, Poseidon, Uranus, Pluton, Lunarian angels literally on fire. Oda loves grabbing big religious and mythic symbols and shoving them into his pirate sandbox. When that same author gives Zoro a permanent Odin cosplay starter pack, that's an archetypal signal. So what if the injury isn't just physical damage, but a sacrifice of perception? A deliberate restriction placed during training. The idea would be Zoro taps into some overwhelming power, cursed blades, Asura, advanced haki, and the only way to control it is to seal part of himself. Not because he can't handle pain, but because he can't safely handle that much information. Close one eye, narrow the world, sharpen the will. Wano's Shinto Buddhist flavor backs this up. We've got monks, shrines, literal gates to the underworld, and samurai making spiritual vows that bind their bodies. Real-world ascetics blindfold themselves, sit in caves, or limit their senses to cultivate inner vision. Zoro training under Mihawk on a crucifix-shaped castle, then coming back with a shut eye, looks a lot less like whoops, sword slip, and a lot more like a vow-like seal. I want to emphasize, that doesn't mean some edgy demon sealed in my eyeball anime trope, but it does raise the question, what exactly is so dangerous that Zoro has to half-blind himself to wield it? If Odin's eye was the price for wisdom, Zoro's might be the price for safely channeling something that wants to eat him alive. Cursed swords, a future black blade, or a level of haki that could burn his soul out. And if that sounds dramatic, just wait until we line that eye up with Enma, and ask what happens when a sword that devours haki meets a swordsman who's literally throttling his own vision. Imu, Mihawk, and the eye motif, who really sees the world? And this is where Zoro's eye stops being just a cool character design choice and starts looking like Oda accidentally left a giant neon sign over the plot. Because if we're going to talk about one-eyed monsters, we kind of have to talk about the biggest jump scare in the entire series, Emu's eye. That panel is disgusting in the best way. Just a single pupil floating in darkness, framed by shadow and those weird, almost reptilian lashes staring straight at us from above the empty throne. No dialogue, no exposition, just, hey, by the way, the world government has a horror movie living in its attic. It's not just an eye, it's staged as an all-seeing surveillance camera that learned how to feel contempt. Now compare that to Mihawk, who is basically what happens if a falcon and a cathedral window had a baby. The story literally calls them hawk eyes. We see him track Luffy in the middle of Marineford chaos, read Zoro's resolve the second they meet, and casually aim slashes across an ocean like he's clicking a mini-map. His power isn't just sword skill, it's presented as vision. He sees the true nature of opponents, the distance, the intent, the fear. And here's an interesting thing. Oda keeps going back to eye close-ups whenever someone is about to break the power system. Luffy's Gear 5 awakening, extreme eye focus before the cartoon god shows up. Katakuri's future sight, those pupil shots every time he reads the timeline like it's a YouTube scrub bar. Enel's mantra, eyes and ears tied together as this smug, all-range perception. Even Sanji's post-time skip, I reveal, is a fake-out of this exact trope, to which I say, yes, Oda is bullying us personally. So Zoro goes to train under the man with the strongest eyes in the world, the guy whose whole brand is, I see everything, and comes back with one eye permanently closed. That is almost too on the nose as a visual metaphor. It reads like Mihawk teaches him how to expand his vision, and Zoro's response is, cool, I'm going to literally shut half of that off. It's the idea of learning to limit what you see, or maybe choosing not to see everything, because as far as Zoro is concerned, overthinking is how you die. If Imu is the oppressive, all-seeing eye of the current world order, then Zoro's closed eye starts looking like a tiny rebellion. He's the guy who will fight without needing to see the entire chessboard, who refuses the God's eye view on principle. And, to be fair, this is very in character. This is the man who gets lost in a straight hallway. Omniscience would just be wasted on him. I want to emphasize how clean this sets up a future thematic clash. Mihawk as the one who sees everything, Imu as the one who watches everything, and Zoro as the one who decides what not to see. The obvious symbolism _link_hook is that his final evolution isn't just stronger slashes, it's opening that eye when the era itself changes. When the old surveillance god falls, the swordsman who rejected that vision might finally look at the world directly, and that's exactly where his next opponents come in. The sealed power theory. Is Zoro's eye a safety lock on his haki? So if Zoro is the guy who chooses what not to see, we kind of have to ask the obvious cursed eyeball question, what happens when he finally decides to see everything? Because as far as power teases go, Oda has been dangling that shut eye in front of us like a do not push button on a nuclear reactor. Here's an interesting thing. When Zoro's Conqueror's haki finally explodes on Onigashima, it's not framed as a new download. Kaido literally pauses mid-beating and goes, "You too have the color of the Supreme King." That's not, "Congrats on the unlock." That's, "Oh, this was in you the whole time, and you were too busy doing sit-ups to notice." It retroactively recontextualizes everything. The Monet scene on Punk Hazard, where he just walks at her and she collapses, body frozen, no contact? That suddenly looks a lot less like strong killing intent, and a lot more like baby's first Haoshoku spike leaking out of a guy who doesn't know his own settings. And, to be fair, the series has been quietly training us for that. Zoro casually knocking out fodder just by entering a room, staring down killers, brushing off the bloodlust of cursed blades that should have eaten his soul alive. Sandai Kitetsu tries to claim his arm in Logetown. He just yeets it in the air and bets his life on luck. Most people die. Zoro gets a new main. That's not normal willpower. That's your haki system is on demo mode but still breaking the hardware. So, the sealed power theory says during the time skip, Mihawk probably looked at this walking OSHA violation of a student and went, "Yeah, we need a limiter." Not just training his armament and observation, but forcing him to confront raw, unfiltered Conqueror's presence. Imagine Zoro swinging a sword and accidentally knocking Perona out of the castle every time he breathes too hard. Fun, but not efficient. I want to emphasize how brutal that training could have been. Mihawk's eyes are literal targeting reticles. Zoro comes in with 2 eyes, leaves with 1 scarred shut, and we're supposed to think that's just a quirky design choice? The idea is that Mihawk teaches him to compress his perception and will into a smaller, denser point. The scarred eye becomes a kind of spiritual safety lock. Close it, and you're running on limited output. Open it, and you risk burning out, overloading allies, or shredding your own body when you push past your limits. And then Enma shows up and basically cosplays as the same concept. Enma drags Haki out of Zoro like a vacuum cleaner from hell. If he doesn't regulate, he literally withers. He has to learn fine-tuned throttling. How much armament, where, when. To which I say, what if the eye is the biological prototype of that same idea? His body as Enma. His brain manually deciding not to let his perception and killing intent leak 24/7. So, when that limiter finally comes off, whether the eye physically opens or we get some Asura-style inner eye reveal, the payoff is obvious. Black blade-level armament on all three swords, sniper-tier observation that cuts through lies and illusions, and fully conscious Conqueror's Haki, braided into every swing. A true King of Hell mode, where the room itself bows or breaks. And the scary part is that's still only half the story, because the swords he's carrying might be just as sealed as he is. Sword spirits and shared sight. What if Zoro isn't the only one looking? But if Zoro's swords are just as sealed as he is, we kind of have to ask the cursed question, what if he's not the only one looking out of that body? We already know swords in One Piece are weirdly alive. This isn't just respect your weapon, kids. We have entire grades, famous names, and then the Kitetsu line, which is literally introduced as, yeah, this thing kills its owner for fun. Enma straight up yanks Zoro's Haki like it's slurping a milkshake. Shusui had a national grave robbery incident attached to it. These blades have tempers, preferences, reputations. As far as weapon systems go, they're closer to partners with a criminal record than inanimate steel. And Zoro doesn't just treat them like tools. He talks to them, he apologizes to them, he gets mad at them. He senses when Enma is acting up and reins it in like a misbehaving dog. Compare that to, say, Brook, who loves his sword, but isn't out here having full-on mood negotiations with Soul Solid. Zoro is functioning like a sword therapist. I want to emphasize how unusual that is even in this already cursed ecosystem. So, here's an interesting thing. All of that got ramped up after Mihawk. 2 years on an island with the greatest swordsman alive, surrounded by baboons copying sword styles, and we think the training was just swing harder? Come on. Mihawk's whole vibe is hyper-focus and terrifying eyes. It actually makes a lot of sense that part of Zoro's training was learning to synchronize with his blades so deeply that his senses partially merged with them. That's the theory. To reach Mihawk-level precision, Zoro had to stop treating his swords as external objects and start treating them as extra sense organs. New perception in, old perception out. And to be fair, that sounds insane until you remember observation Haki is already feel the presence, intent, and emotions of others. Now imagine stacking that with 3 cursed metal antennas permanently tuned to killing intent. This is where the closed eye comes in. Instead of just battle scar for edge points, it might be a literal anchor for that shared sight. Zoro shuts one human eye so he can open the perspective of 3 inhuman ones. He's not seeing the battlefield as light bouncing off objects. He's seeing vectors of hostility, spiritual pressure, and the will of his blades pulling toward targets. People say, that's just advanced observation. To which I say, sure, but your observation doesn't try to eat your soul like Enma. Look back against Mr. 1. Zoro fights half-blind, covered in blood and rubble, and still tracks every movement. In thick smoke, chaotic war zones, even literally spinning midair, he doesn't lose enemies. It feels less like a guy watching and more like a magnet aligning to threats. That's beyond the vague "I sense him" we see from basic observation users. And if his perception is now partially outsourced into his swords, that has a wild implication for the final saga. When Zoro forges a black blade or swaps out a sword again, he's not just changing damage numbers, he's changing his eyes. His entire way of reading the world might shift overnight. What happens when the King of Hell finally forges a weapon that can see the weight of a person's sin or the shape of their fate? That's where this gets really scary. From demon to King of Hell, Zoro's underworld branding explained. So when Zoro says he'll become the King of Hell, that isn't just a Jim Bro rebrand of "I'm gonna try really hard." That's a lore nuke. Because as far as nicknames go, this man has been speedrunning a mythological promotion ladder. We start with pirate hunter Zoro. Grounded, transactional, very "I take heads, you pay me." Then the crew starts calling him a demon. Enemies see literal horned silhouettes. And suddenly we've slid from bounty hunter to yokai. Asura takes that even further. Now he's a three-headed, nine-sword war god hallucination that somehow cuts you physically. And to be fair, by the time Wano slaps King of Hell on top of that stack, it feels like Oda just hit random on the edgy title generator. To which I say, no, this is where it finally syncs with the setting. Here's an interesting thing about Wano. It's soaked in Buddhist and folkloric underworld imagery. You have Jigoku, the Hell Realms. You have Enma, literally named after Enma-O, the Judge of the Dead. You have Oni, underworld gates, and this idea that samurai don't just kill people, they decide where those souls are headed. Zoro wielding Enma while calling himself King of Hell is basically him auditioning for regional manager of the afterlife. He's not just a killer. He's a psychopomp with 3 swords and anger issues. Now plug Ryuma into that. Ryuma is Wano's dragon-slaying guardian deity, the guy whose grave is treated as sacred national infrastructure. Then Moriah shows up, steals the corpse, yoinks the sword, and turns him into a zombie mini-boss. That's not just grave robbing, that's spiritual vandalism. The country's literal sword god is puppeted on Thriller bark long before Kaido ever lands. The balance was already a mess. So when Zoro, who looks like Ryuma's copy-paste cousin, comes to Wano, reclaims Shusui's legacy, and then takes up Enma, it reads like the system trying to reboot. The King of Hell persona isn't about cool black flames and wow, edgy cursed swords. It's a job description. The swordsman who sends tyrants, dragons, and fake deities back to the underworld. Cue they've been dodging. Look at his move names. Eno Santoryu, Demon Aura, Asura. His power-up is literally black flames licking off cursed-looking blades while he walks around half-dead from Enma draining his life. He's fighting in that liminal space between life and death, like every swing is both an execution and a verdict. I want to emphasize, this is the same guy who once said he'd never pray again, now branded with the language of gods and hell kings. So what happens when the gods of the world government finally get dragged down? Someone has to swing the sword. Someone has to be the one who says, you don't get to call yourself a god anymore and make it stick. Wano was the local test run. Dethrone a dragon, judge a false shogun, restore a desecrated legacy. The final saga is just that idea exported globally. And if Luffy is the sun god who frees people, Zoro might be the shadow that makes that sun scary to the people who abuse their divinity. Which raises a nasty question for later. What does the King of Hell do when the person on the chopping block is his own final opponent. Ryuma's shadow. Is Zoro meant to replace a fallen guardian deity? So when we call Zoro the shadow that makes the sun scary, that's not just edgy merch text. That's basically Ryuma's job description copy-pasted into a new save file. Because as far as Wano is concerned, Ryuma wasn't just a good swordsman. He was a walking national firewall. Ryuma is the guy who slays a dragon over Wano's skies and then casually speedruns mythologization. In Monsters, he's already drawn as Zoro's proto-model, and by the time we get to Wano, people literally worship him as a godlike protector. Sword god, guardian deity, all that. He's the story parents tell their kids so they don't grow up to be Orochi. Wano's whole ideal of what a sword is for gets stapled to Ryuma's name. And then Thriller Bark happens, and Oda goes, "Cool, let's dig up the god." We meet Ryuma as a zombie, corpse stolen from Wano, shadow stapled on, wielding Shusui, the national treasure. That fight with Zoro is weirdly respectful from frame one. No trash talk, no clowning, just two guys who immediately clock that the other lives by the same code. Ryuma literally laughs as he burns up, calls Zoro by name, and hands over Shusui like he's passing a torch, not losing a drop. Here's an interesting thing. That sword transfer is insane if you treat it as just loot. A fallen guardian deity, body desecrated, homeland far away, looks at some foreign pirate hunter and goes, "Yeah, you can hold my country." Shusui leaving Wano with Zoro is basically Ryuma outsourcing national security to the next generation because the old system already failed. I want to emphasize how wild that is symbolically. Fast forward to Wano's present. Ryuma's grave robbed, Shusui gone, Kaido and Orochi ruling, the dragon slayer god replaced by an actual dragon tyrant. There's no guardian deity, no dragon slayer, just a vague, broken memory of what Wano's swordsmanship used to mean. Spiritually, the country's a mess. The altar's empty. And who walks into that vacuum? The same guy Ryuma chose. Zoro shows up with Wado Ichimonji, a Kozaburo blade, then takes Enma, the other Kozaburo blade, and proceeds to scar Kaido after pushing back King, the right-hand monster who literally has wings and fire. He calls himself the King of Hell and coats his swords in Conqueror's haki, to which I say, that's not subtle. That's Oda writing a new guardian deity into existence in real time. Zoro is Ryuma 2.0, but upgraded, not bound to Wano's border, but to the wider world's need for a dragon slayer of oppressive gods. And to be fair, Oda's been telegraphing that. Shimotsuki Village, Ryuma's look, the Black Blade talk, it's all converging. So what's the final step? Probably the moment Zoro forges his own Black Blade, or that sealed left eye opens, or he wins the duel that crowns him the world's greatest. That's when he fully steps into Ryuma's abandoned archetype, not just as Wano's protector, but as the guy who cuts down the next untouchable deity. And if that sounds dramatic, wait until we talk about which god might actually be on the chopping block. The hidden conqueror, Zoro's kingly will, was never about thrones. And here's where the story does something kind of evil in a good way. It gives Zoro Conqueror's haki, the literal, "you're born to be a king" power, and then hands him a title that sounds like a final boss in a From Software DLC. But the trick is that Oda is quietly redefining what king even means through this guy. On paper, Hao Shoku is simple. It's the haki of those destined to stand above others, the people whose will is so overclocked that weaker minds just blue screen in their presence. You walk into a room, glare, and suddenly half the extras are napping. That's the textbook. That's the system. But here's an interesting thing. Once you put it on Luffy and Zoro, it stops being one power and starts looking like two philosophies that accidentally share a name. Luffy's Conqueror's haki is loud, liberating, almost annoyingly charismatic. He knocks people out, yes, but he also pulls people in. Alabasta, Dressrosa, Wano, armies, samurai, random weirdos all orbit him because his will says, "We're going to be free, come with me." And people just do. Zoro's? Zoro's is the opposite of a recruitment poster. His haki feels internal, heavy, executioner-like. He doesn't gather followers, he forces submission. You either withstand that killing intent or you get spiritually beheaded on the spot. And to be fair, that tracks perfectly with who he's always been. Zoro has literally rejected leadership roles from day one. He turns down being a bounty hunter captain. He immediately defers to Luffy on the ship. And any time someone tries to treat him like the number 2 commander, he looks vaguely offended, like you just asked him to do paperwork. Because as far as his will is concerned, he only needs to be king of his own path. People respect him, fear him, follow his orders in a pinch, but that's a side effect, not the goal. That's why King of Hell fits way better than Future Admiral, or any other boring title fans tried to staple onto him. This is not a king of nations. This is a king of the threshold, life and death, justice and punishment. It's a domain that doesn't require subjects, just transgressors. You don't live under Zoro. You survive being judged by Zoro. His Conqueror's haki isn't a banner, it's a guillotine. And that loops us directly back to Ryuma. A guardian deity doesn't rule the people. It stands above the city and cuts down dragons. It protects, it punishes, it doesn't hold elections. Ryuma's legend is all about that guardian judge archetype, and I want to emphasize how neatly Zoro's flavor of kingship slots into that. He's not a pirate king mold. He's a sword god in training. So when we talk about Final Saga Zoro, don't picture him rallying fleets. Picture gods, dragons, and tyrants literally buckling under that killing intent alone. No speeches, no freedom slogans, just kneel or be cut. And if that sounds extreme, wait until we look at which specific untouchable beings are actually built to be on the receiving end of that stare. Joy Boy's Swordsman. Why the Pirate King needs a King of Hell. Kneel or be cut is funny, until you realize that might literally be the job description for Joy Boy's right-hand man. Because as far as the story is concerned, Luffy is not built to be the guy who says, "No, you don't get to abuse this freedom." That's Zoro's territory. That's King of Hell HR. Here's an interesting thing about Luffy as Joy Boy that people kind of gloss over. Joy Boy is a liberator archetype. He brings the drums, the laughter, the rubbery war crimes against physics. He breaks chains, topples systems, punches gods, and then wanders off to the next island. He's not drafting constitutions. He's not doing post-revolution zoning laws. The series keeps showing you this. Alabasta, Dressrosa, Wano. Luffy beats the tyrant, refuses the crown, and leaves a giant freedom-shaped hole for everyone else to fill. Which sounds romantic, until you ask, what happens when the next tyrant walks into that power vacuum? Any new world needs more than a symbol of freedom. It needs people who will enforce that freedom when the cameras are off. Someone has to stand between the vulnerable and the inevitable resurgence of actually I should be king now energy. And to be fair, Nika's not doing paperwork. That's where Zoro slides in like a tax audit with Aobs. He's the enforcer of the dream. Luffy says, "Let's be free," and Zoro says, "And if you betray that, I will kill you." That's not Fanon. That's literally Barity Zoro telling a half-dead rubber kid, "If you ever step on my ambition, I'll end you." Same pattern at Water 7. Luffy's emotionally torn about Usopp rejoining. Zoro draws the hard line. No re-entry without an apology. No disrespect to the captain. No turning the crew into a vague mess of feelings where nobody knows what the rules are. I want to emphasize how structural this is. Luffy's justice is intuitive and personal. Zoro's is codified and merciless. Luffy forgives Bellamy. Zoro cuts Pika in half for terrorizing civilians and treats it like garbage duty. Luffy laughs off insults. Zoro demands dignity and respect that Luffy doesn't even verbalize. You can't build a lasting era on vibes alone, so the story quietly hands the harsh side of justice to the swordsman. Now, plug that into Joy Boy prophecy logic. If Joy Boy is the sun that rises, Zoro is the shadow that moves with it, making sure that light isn't weaponized. King of Hell isn't edgy cosplay. It's a job description in a world where demons are often just humans with unchecked power. Joy Boy frees the slaves. King of Hell cuts down the slavers who try to come back in fancy new uniforms. So when we hit the final conflict, don't be shocked if Luffy is the one who breaks the world government system, but Zoro is the one who personally executes the symbols of the old era. Mihawk as the last test of the old world sword god. A Gorosei swordsman trying to judge the new age and getting bisected mid-sentence. Maybe even celestial dragons hiding behind divine right and finding out what happens when a man who promised to cut God himself walks into their throne room. And if that sounds extreme, just wait until we talk about what it actually means for a guy like that to be carrying Wano's god swords and possibly Wano's god's will. Because the Mihawk endgame, a duel that's bigger than a title. So when we say Zoro might walk into Mary Joey's and cut God, that's not just edgy fan art energy. It's set up for the actual endgame boss of his story, Dracul Mihawk. Because as far as Zoro is concerned, his entire life has been pointed at one sentence: "I'll be the world's greatest swordsman." And that sentence is stapled directly onto Luffy's dream of Pirate King. Zoro's promise to Kuina only really locks in when he kneels in front of Mihawk and says, "I'll never lose again until I defeat you." That's the moment his personal grief fuses with Luffy's era. If Luffy fails, Zoro's title is meaningless. If Zoro fails, Luffy's Pirate King fantasy is missing its right hand. It's a package deal, which is very funny for a guy who pretends he doesn't care about dream speeches. Now look at Mihawk's side of the board. Warlord, ex-Shichibukai, now cross-guild co-leader hanging out with Buggy and Crocodile like he accidentally joined a meme-stock Discord. He's still the man sitting above every swordsman on the planet, but he's also kind of ideologically unemployed. The world is on fire, the old order is collapsing, and Mihawk's biggest concern is having too many Marines on his lawn. Here's an interesting thing. Mihawk is the final form of the old world's idea of strength, pure individual mastery. Yoru is the only confirmed Black Blade. His observation is so insane. His eyes are literally styled as Hawk's eyes. He sails alone, lives alone, fights alone, and stands for nothing except "I am the best." People call him a warlord of the sea, but he's really a warlord of isolation. Zoro is drifting in the opposite direction. Every power-up he gets drags him deeper into legacy and myth. Shimotsuki village secretly tied to Wano, wielding Wado and Enma from the same legendary smith, paralleling Ryuma the sword god, awakening conquerors' haki, and then just casually branding himself King of Hell. He's not just a better Mihawk. He's becoming a walking convergence of bloodline, cursed blades, and Joy Boy's dawn. One man is solitary perfection. The other is purpose-driven evolution strapped to a pirate sun god. And that's where the eye motif turns their duel into a symbolic duel. Mihawk is the ultimate seer of this age, the guy who sees the true nature of things. Zoro is the one-eyed, maybe sealed, maybe sacrificed warrior of the next. People keep asking, what if Zoro's eye opens and it's some busted power? To which I say, narratively, it's way scarier if it stays closed and still beats the man who sees everything. When those two finally cross blades for real, it's not just a belt match. It's a referendum on what swordsmanship is allowed to be in the new world. Does it stay as strength for its own sake, or does it become strength that exists to carve out and protect a new order? I want to emphasize, Zoro defeating Mihawk isn't just rolling credits on a rivalry. It's closing the book on an era where the sword crowns the self, and opening one where the sword crowns the future. And if that sounds dramatic, wait until we talk about what happens when that same future has to cut straight through the people writing the world's rules. Gorosei Swordsman and the final test of Wano's legacy. So if Mihawk is the end of the old title game, who actually signs off on that era dying? Because as far as the story's concerned, the people who literally sign off on everything are 5 bald guys and their very not subtle murder weapons. Here's an interesting thing. Oda did not have to make the Gorosei sword guys. He could have given them fancy pens, a logia or two called it a day. Instead, we've got the long-haired elder casually holding a gigantic nodachi that looks like it ate shusui for breakfast, and another elder strolling around with a classic katana like he's your terrifying grandpa at New Year's. These are not random design choices. These are Chekhov's old men with blades. And to be fair, once you accept that, the power ceiling for their weapons gets insane very fast. If Yoru is a supreme-grade black blade in the hands of the world's strongest swordsman, what do you give the guys who quietly puppeteered the Void Century, genocided entire islands, and ordered CP0 to speedrun a Yonko execution? You probably don't hand them mass-produced marine sabers. You give them Mato that feel wrong, cursed swords that might predate Wano's current calendar, maybe even black blades forged back when the world conquest first went down, soaking in 800 years of institutional malice. People like to say, no way anything can surpass Yoru in lore importance, to which I say, mate, have you met Oda's escalation problem? If any swords are going to rival or even overshadow Yoru on the myth scale, it's the blades held by the guys sitting above the world government logo. That's how you make Zoro's endgame fights not just strong, but cosmically loaded. Because imagine the framing. Wano's legacy on one side, the world's hidden rulers on the other. Shimotsuki style, Ryuma's spiritual successor, the dual heirs of Kozaburo's forge in Wado and Enma, all compressed into one very angry, one-eyed man. And across from him, a blade that has been enforcing the natural order since before anyone remembered what the old order even was. That's not just a duel, that's a stress test for the entire Wano mythos. Does Ryuma's will still matter when it hits the edge that once cut down ancient kings? Narratively, it actually makes too much sense. Luffy goes after Imu, after the system, after the concept of a world where joy is illegal. Zoro, branded King of Hell, takes the more literal job, sending false elders to the underworld. His swords don't just slice bodies, they cut the spiritual authority these guys have claimed over life and death, over who's allowed to exist. And I want to emphasize, if we're ever going to see Zoro's Wano-forged style pushed past Mihawk, past King, past anything we understand about Haki and cursed steel, it's going to be when those hidden blades finally leave their comfy council chamber. The real peak of sword mythology isn't just Zoro versus Mihawk. It's Zoro versus the people who thought they could edit the world's script with a stroke of their swords. Which raises a terrifying little question for the next part. What kind of monster do you have to be, spiritually, to even qualify to swing a sword like that in the first place? Black blades and the Void Century. Did ancient swords shape the world? So when we ask, what kind of monster do you have to be to swing a sword like that? The series quietly answers, the kind of monster who can rewrite history just by hardening steel. Because as far as one-piece superweapons go, we keep staring at the giant boat nukes and sea kings and kind of ignoring the tiny, handheld apocalypse called a black blade. Here's an interesting thing we actually know. Black blades are not a natural resource. You don't mine them. You don't buy them off Amazon Wano. They're forged over time in battle by a swordsman's haki literally saturating the metal until it permanently changes. Ryuma's Shusui, Mihawk's Yoru. That's it. 2 confirmed success stories in a world where people can punch light and turn into earthquakes, which already makes them feel less like weapons and more like save files of a person's entire combat life. Now scale that idea back 800 years. If Mihawk and Ryuma can do this in the modern, watered-down age, what did the top tiers of the Void Century look like? We're told that era had technology and powers that terrify the world government even now. So, it's not crazy to imagine elite warriors from ancient kingdoms walking around with entire arsenals of black blades, each one a portable permanent conqueror's haki reactor. People like to say, wouldn't that break the power system? To which I say, yes, that's the point. That's exactly why the people who won the war would want that knowledge erased. We obsess over Pluton and Poseidon as if the fear is just about size. Big ship, big cannon, big sea king. But what if the real nightmare for the Gorosei isn't just ancient hardware, it's ancient software? Techniques that let any sufficiently insane swordsman hard-lock their strength into steel and pass it down. Imagine a world where a kingdom's trump card isn't a battleship. It's a lineage of blades that never weaken, only stack willpower across generations. That is a balance of power problem on a cosmic scale. And to be fair, Wano is screaming this at us. Land of legendary smiths, cursed swords, and one guy, Shimotsuki Kozaburo, who forges both Wado Ichimonji and Enma, then mysteriously leaves and founds a village in the East Blue. After the Void Century, Wano slams the door shut. Why? The official answer is, we fear outsiders. But the pattern looks a lot more like a nuclear state deciding, yeah, we're done exporting reactors. Lock the borders, bury the manuals, pretend black blade knowledge is a myth. Which is why I want to emphasize how insane it is that Zoro is on track to do this again, in public, on camera, while fighting Yonko. When he turns one of his swords black, and the story has basically hung a neon sign over Enma, that's not just a personal achievement, that's a lost technology booting back up. It says to the world, the Void Century sword meta is live again. And who's carrying it? The possible Shimotsuki descendant from an illegal Wano colony, wielding the blade of Wano's sword god look-alike, calling himself King of Hell, and sailing under Joy Boy 2.0. When Zoro's blade finally turns black, it won't just echo Ryuma. It'll echo every forgotten monster who once carved the world beside the original Joy Boy. Which raises a much worse question for the next part. If his sword is the bridge, what exactly is waiting on the other side of that cut? The site sacrifice contract, what Zoro may have agreed to. Off panel. So if Zoro's sword is the bridge, then the eye is the toll booth. You don't just wake up one day missing depth perception and call it character development. That's a narrative check Oda has very obviously not cashed yet. Here's an interesting thing. The time skip is the single most important training arc of Zoro's life, and we see almost none of it. With Luffy, we watch Rayleigh throw him into the hockey washing machine. Sanji gets the Okama Hell montage. Zoro, we get Please Train Me, cut to 2 years later. New drip, new scar, no explanation. That's not laziness. That's a deliberate blank space where you can hide a life-defining contract. So let's pitch the site sacrifice contract. Not a legal document, more like a Wano-flavored Faustian bargain. Zoro shows up on Kuregana, fresh off Thriller Bark, where he literally offered his life, his pride, and his entire future to Kuma, just so Luffy could keep going. This is the guy who stood in a blood ocean and said nothing happened. You're telling me that same man wouldn't agree to seal a part of himself away if it meant he could actually stand next to the future Pirate King? To which I say, of course he would. That's like his whole brand. Because, as far as character consistency goes, this is the logical escalation. Thriller Bark Zoro was willing to die for the dream. Time skip Zoro is willing to live with a permanent wound for it. One is a heroic sacrifice. The other is a quiet, ongoing cost. And to be fair, that's way darker. Now, plug Mihawk into this. Mihawk is sitting there with his hawk eyes, his confirmed black blade, his terrifying perception, staring at this green-haired lunatic who has latent conqueror's haki, a bunch of cursed sword affinity, and absolutely no chill. You can almost hear Mihawk going, if I actually unlock all of this at once, he either kills himself, kills his crew, or cuts the island in half by sneezing. So Mihawk imposes a limiter, a seal, a training handicap disguised as a scar. Did Zoro blind himself on purpose to dull his perception until his haki discipline caught up? Did he accept a curse that bound part of his will and stored it in that eye? Did he literally merge deeper with his sword's spirits, forcing one eye to look inward instead of out? I want to emphasize we're in theory land, but this kind of mess is exactly what makes the idea fun. The payoff, though, is crystal. At some point, the story needs a moment where Zoro decides the world is finally bad enough, the stakes are finally high enough that he can risk unsealing whatever's behind that lid without turning into the monster people in Wano already kind of think he is. That's your mystery, _contract_hook. The eye opens, the limiter breaks, and we find out what Zoro and Mihawk actually gambled back on that empty island. And if that's true, then the next question is brutal. What kind of enemy justifies cashing in that final piece of himself? When the eye opens, predicting Zoro's final awakening moment. So if that final piece of himself is locked behind the scar, Oda is not spending that coin on a cool panel in some random mid-arc skirmish. This is the guy who sat on Gear 5 for, 1,000 years of publication time. The eye is the same category of payoff. When it opens, the story is not just saying, Zoro got a new form. It's saying, the world just tilted. Because as far as Oda's pattern goes, big reveals are glued to global turning points. Gear 2 came with the CP9 escalation, Gear 4 with the Yonko era, Gear 5 with the literal awakening of a mythic god fruit. So if Zoro's eye is a sealed state, you don't spend that on strong Vice Admiral number 7. You spend it on something that rewrites the power map. Mihawk falling, a Gorosei swordsman being exposed, Luffy's heart stopping in the final war, or some void century weapon waking up and deciding, actually, Genocide Round 2 sounds fun. And to be fair, all of those triggers line up a little too well with Zoro's personal backlog of issues. Mihawk is the promise. The Gorosei swordsman is the system. Luffy's near-death is the captain. The ancient weapon is the world's curse. Any one of those is big. The eye feels like it wants the moment where at least 2, probably 3 of them collide, and Oda just goes, okay, this is where the swordsman cashes in. Here's an interesting thing. We can frame it as a triple convergence. The eye opens at the exact time Zoro forges his first true black blade, fully controls Conqueror's coating consciously, and points that combined state at something the story treats as a god. Imu on a throne, a Gorosei monster form, or a dragon that makes Kaido look like training mode. That's when the King of Hell title stops being edgy merch and becomes a job description. I want to emphasize how Wano quietly set this up as spiritual, not just mechanical. Wano's language is all about dawn, karma, inherited will. Ryuma the sword god, Shimotsuka Kozaburo leaving the closed country, Shimotsuki village being this illegal Wano offshoot in the East Blue. Zoro is literally the wandering interest payment on a 400-year rebellion tab. The eye-opening reads like enlightenment. Ryuma's legacy paid in full, the Shimotsuki clan's long, quiet no to the shogunate and the world government finally cashing out through their most violent monk. Visually, Oda almost has to go weird, not just, oh, it's yellow now. We're talking a new iris pattern, maybe a Mihawk-style hawk's eye pushed into something more demonic, or a visible haki ring that lets him read souls and killing intent like colors. Mechanically, think Asura, but stabilized, a fusion state where his 3 blades and his spirit are one entity, and that old 9-sword illusion was just the beta test he could barely hold without dying. People ask, isn't that overpowered? To which I say, have you seen Luffy punch reality lately? The real question is, when that eye finally opens, what kind of world is Zoro agreeing to see? Because he's not just unlocking a cosmetic, he's choosing a perspective, a world where gods can be cut, where fate is just another thing you can scar. And once he makes that choice, the only mystery left is how much hell he's willing to unleash on anyone stupid enough to stand between that vision and Luffy's dawn. Zoro's place in history, from lost Shimotsuki to legend of the New Age. So when that eye finally opens and Zoro signs off on a world where gods are cuttable and fate is just another thing you can scar, what does history even do with a guy like that? Because as far as in-universe historians go, Zoro is a walking filing error. He doesn't fit in one folder. He's a Shimotsuki maybe prince, a Ryuma cosplayer who accidentally speedran into the same title, a king of hell, a hidden conqueror, and the guy who's probably going to hand-forge a black blade that pings the Void Century radar. We've basically built this layered identity stack, possible lost Shimotsuki heir from an illegal Wano colony, wielding 2 Kozaburo specials in Wado and Enma, spiritually mirroring Ryuma from Monsters, and then on top of that, the King of Hell persona that treats cursed swords like emotional support demons. People like to say, he's just the world's greatest swordsman in training, to which I say, That's the floor, not the ceiling. The story is quietly turning him into the definition of what a swordsman even is in the new age. Because look at how Oda sets standards. Roger isn't just Pirate King, he's the metric. Luffy isn't just Joy Boy, he's the template for freedom. Zoro is being built the same way for swordsmanship. Mihawk is the current peak of the old system. Perfect technique, solitary throne, world's strongest. Zoro is the prototype of the next one, a swordsman whose power exists to serve someone else's dawn. Future generations won't just ask, "Can I beat Mihawk?" They'll ask, "Am I carrying my blade the way Roronoa Zoro did?" And Wano's going to be the first place that codifies that. Imagine their chronicles. The foreigner from a forgotten Shimotsuki branch who walked in with Wado, reclaimed Enma, returned Shusui's honor after its zombie cosplay phase, and literally avenged Ryuma's desecration. He helps free the country from a dragon tyrant, stands on the same rooftop where legends died, and then sails away to go reshape the global understanding of a swordsman. That's not a guest appearance. That's how you write a new household deity. Zoom out, and the wider world gets an even wilder version. Zoro becomes the right hand of the Pirate King/Joy Boy, the man whose blades cut down the last guardians of the old world order. Mihawk, Gorosei sword freaks, whoever's left holding a holy title. His black blade isn't just strong, it's the weapon that proved you can literally carve a new era into existence. And to be fair, the scarred eye is going to do half the PR work, because here's an interesting thing. History loves a sight-sacrificed warrior. Odin, mythic seers, all that. Zoro's going to get retold as the man who gave up part of his sight to see a better world into existence. Kids won't say, "He trained with Mihawk and cut a lot of stuff." They'll whisper, "He closed an eye, walked through hell, and came back seeing farther than the gods." Is that literally true? Probably not. Is it perfect One Piece myth energy? Absolutely. I want to emphasize, this reframes his whole journey. It stops being a cute side quest attached to Luffy's dream and becomes a parallel saga. A man who turned cursed blades into tools, scars into symbols, and a childhood promise into a legend that's going to outlive the age of pirates itself. And the scary part is, we still haven't seen what that eye looks like when the legend finally catches up to him. From Shimotsuki village to Wano, Zoro's lineage as the missing bridge. So when we talk about Zoro as a walking urban legend with a sword problem, there's one more layer we kind of have to admit. This dude might literally be the missing piece between a closed-off samurai nation and the dumb little harbor in East Blue where the story started. Because as far as obvious in hindsight clues go, Shimotsuki village is wild. The village is literally named Shimotsuki. The dojo master is Koshiro. His daughter is a girl genius swordsman who dies tragically and hands Zoro Wado Ichimonji. Then Oda drops in SBS volume 96 that Shimotsuki Kozaburo left Wano, wandered, and founded a village in the East Blue, forging both Enma and Wado. People used to go, "A coincidence," to which I say, "Mate, Oda does not accidentally duplicate the exact clan name and the exact swordsmith in the exact ocean Zoro starts in." Here's an interesting thing. Once you accept Shimotsuki village as an off-the-books Wano colony, the timeline stops being a vague mess and starts looking like a multi-generational escape plan. Kozaburo bails from isolationist Wano, brings his craft and his ideals overseas, raises a dojo culture around the breath of all things, and a couple generations later, you get Quina and Zoro treating swordsmanship like a religion. That's not random East Blue flavor, That's diaspora storytelling. Now, plug in the daimyo theory. If Zoro is descended from Shimotsuki Ushimaru, or another lost daimyo, his whole journey retroactively locks onto Wano's tragedy. This isn't just guy from nowhere gets cool swords. It's orphaned branch of a fallen clan, slowly boomerangs back home, carrying the blades of their ancestors. Ryuma, the sword god, protects Wano in legend. Ushimaru dies trying to protect it in reality. Zoro shows up generations later, wielding Kozaburo's swords, awakening conquerors, and literally taking the title King of Hell. At what point do we stop calling that a coincidence and start calling it narrative gravity? And, to be fair, Oda never puts a big neon sign saying Zoro is Ushimaru's grandson. But he doesn't need to. The archetype is doing the work. Zoro stops reading as a freak East Blue prodigy and starts reading as the returning heir. Not in the boring paperwork sense, but in the mythic sense. The guy who inherits a broken lineage and fixes it by sheer stubbornness. He's not just chasing Mihawk for clout. He's unconsciously trying to drag a disgraced samurai tradition back into the light. Every time he stands up after getting absolutely deleted by some stronger swordsman, that's a clan refusing to stay dead. I want to emphasize, this background isn't just cute lore wallpaper, it's a structural device. Wano's closed borders. That's the wall that forced Kozaburo to flee and accidentally create Zoro's hometown. The Void Century samurai who sided with Joy Boy? Zoro is their narrative echo, a warrior from Wano's bloodline sailing under the next Joy Boy's flag. Joy Boy's inherited will isn't just about D's laughing in the face of gods. It's about swordsmen who cut open the world. So when Zoro, a probable Shimotsuki heir, forges his own black blade and swings conquerors at the sky, what is he actually cutting? A dragon? A mountain? Or the last excuses keeping the world locked up? And if that's the bridge Oda's building with Zoro, then the next question gets a lot scarier. What kind of god do you have to slay to finish that cut? Ryuma, the dragon, and the prototype, King of Hell. What kind of god do you have to slay? Well, One Piece already showed us the beta version. His name was Ryuma, he killed a dragon, and Wano basically went, cool, that's our entire religion now. So let's rewind to Ryuma's lore for a second, because as far as narrative prototypes go, this guy is the template. In Monsters, he's the sword god who cuts down a literal dragon over the flower capital. In One Piece, that story becomes Wano's founding myth. His black blade Shusui is treated like a national treasure. His grave is a holy site, and his existence is so baked into the country that the people don't just remember him, they orbit him. Ryuma isn't a hero, he's infrastructure. And to be fair, Oda could have left it there. Cool side story, fun thriller bark cameo, move on. But here's an interesting thing. He redraws Ryuma into One Piece with Zoro's face. Same hair, same bandana, same deadpan, I cut things energy. That's not a vague Easter egg. That's the author quietly saying, this is what a world-shaping swordsman looks like. Now, stack Ryuma's feats next to Zoro's. Ryuma slays a dragon in the sky over Wano. Zoro shows up hundreds of years later, and, during the raid, literally slices through Kaido's dragon scales on the rooftop, scars him, and then finishes the arc by cutting down a giant flaming dragon avatar with King of Hell mode. You're supposed to see the rhyme. Wano's samurai look at him swinging Enma and basically speedrun from foreigner to, oh, the guardian deity came back from his lunch break. They offer him Shusui. They frame him as the protector of the capital. they treat his presence as myth repair. People say King of Hell is just edgy branding, to which I say, yes, and that's the point. Ryuma's sword god title is divine, up in the clouds. Zoro's is underworld-coded, down in the dark. One guards from above, one rules from below. It's the same job from opposite sides of the boundary. King of Hell is a swordsman who stands at the border between life and death, land and sky, Wano and the outside world, and decides what gets cut and what gets allowed through. I want to emphasize how much that lines up with Zoro literally seeing the Grim Reaper, walking back from death, and then coating his blades in conquerors like he's enforcing cosmic immigration law. And that's where the endgame scales up. Mihawk is the current mechanical ceiling of the sword system. Ryuma is the mythic ceiling. Zoro surpassing Mihawk is about skill. Surpassing Ryuma is about scope. Ryuma was Wano's guardian. Zoro is being positioned as the world's. Enma and Wado from Kozaburo. Shimotsuki blood, Black Blade foreshadowing, King of Hell imagery. This is all Oda beta testing a global sword god whose jurisdiction is the entire sea. Which raises the uncomfortable follow-up. If Ryuma's dragon was a national problem, what kind of dragon does a global guardian have to cut down next? The cursed blade ecosystem. Why Zoro doesn't just wield swords. He tames them. So if Zoro is being framed as the world's new dragon slayer, we kind of need to talk about the fact that his dragons are already in his hands. Because as far as One Piece is concerned, cursed swords are basically portable boss fights. Look at his lineup. Sandai Kitetsu is literally introduced as, "This sword kills its owner," a bargain bin death flag that any sane person would walk away from. Zoro tosses it in the air, gambles his arm, and wins by flexing more will than the curse. Shusui shows up as a national treasure with a grudge, a black blade forged in Ryuma's battles, so heavy and ominous that even Brook treats it like a haunted museum piece. Enma is straight up described as a demon that draws out too much haki, casually mummifying Zoro's arm in one panel. These aren't tools, they're problem children. And here's an interesting thing. Every time we see other people interact with these kinds of blades, the sword is in charge. Ippon Matsu is terrified of Kitetsu. The samurai of Wano revere Shusui more than Ryuma's actual corpse. Enma nearly kills random test users just by existing. When Odin wielded Enma and Amy no Habakiri, the narrative treats it like an insane flex because no one else could keep up. The pattern is that cursed or named blades impose their will on the user. Zoro flips that script. Sandai Kitetsu stops being a death sentence and just becomes the third one. Shusui in his hands is not a relic. It's a default setting. Enma starts by draining him dry, and Zoro responds by literally restructuring his haki output around it. The sword doesn't tame him. It forces an upgrade, and he bites back harder. People like to say, the sword chose Zoro, to which I say, no, Zoro kidnapped the sword and made it do push-ups. I want to emphasize how weird this is in the broader sword ecosystem Oda's built. We have Meito grades as a kind of quality tier list, black blades like Yoru and Shusui as the endgame evolution, and cursed lines like Kitetsu as the glitchy, unstable branch of the system. Most characters exist inside that system. Mihawk has already finished the game with a permanent black blade. Wano's samurai are obsessed with inheriting great swords, not changing them. Zoro is the outlier apex predator sitting on top of all of this, actively dragging unstable weapons toward a new equilibrium. And to be fair, Oda has literally told us black blades are forged through battle, not found. Combine that with Enma's hockey-hungry training arc and Zoro coating his swords with conquerors, and the story is quietly screaming that his real final power isn't just bigger numbers on his hockey bar, it's the ability to permanently overwrite a cursed blade's nature to force it into black blade status by conquering it. Imagine Sandai Kitetsu, historically a murder sword, turned into a disciplined black blade on panel. Imagine Enma, the demon, being purified not by exorcism, but by submission. If that's where we're headed, then Zoro isn't just the world's guardian swordsman. He's the evolutionary endpoint of swords themselves. Which raises an even dumber, scarier question. What happens when a guy who can domesticate demon blades finally swings at something that isn't supposed to be cut at all? Black blades and black kings. Conqueror's hockey as a forge, not a flex. So when people say black blades are just swords that fought a lot, to which I say, cool, by that logic, my keyboard should be a supreme-grade weapon by now? The series keeps repeating this line about them being forged in battle, but that's a very Oda way of giving us a vague answer that secretly hides a much scarier system. Because as far as we actually know, there are only two confirmed black blades in the story, Mihawk's Yoru and Ryuma's Shusui, both tied to guys who are treated less like strong duelists and more like walking natural disasters. Oda has said black blades are made, not found, which already implies process, not rarity. Yoru didn't drop from a loot chest. Mihawk brute-forced reality until his sword's nature changed. Same with Ryuma, the literal sword god of Wano, whose whole deal is, my presence alone rewrites the battlefield. That's not just battle experience, that's will pollution. Here's an interesting thing. Conqueror's hockey is defined as imposing your will on others. We usually treat that as a flex. Knock out some fodder, crack the sky, cool. But what if that's the surface symptom, not the core idea? If Haoshoku is the ability to overwrite the world with your intent, then coating your sword in it isn't just a damage buff. It's step one of engraving your will onto metal until the metal itself refuses to be anything else. We actually see the prototype of this with Zoro and Enma. At first, Enma is a demon vacuum cleaner, just draining his haki and ballooning his arm like a bad allergy test. The sword is imposing its will on him. Over Wano, that flips. Zoro learns to constantly pour out more haki, to the point where Enma stops misbehaving because it's being overfed. He's not just taming a cursed blade, he's saturating it. If black blades are swords whose very atoms have been permanently dyed by a king's will, Enma is literally mid-process right now. And to be fair, Oda basically telegraphed this when Zoro starts coating his swords with conquerors against Kaido. That's the exact moment the series goes, oh, by the way, this guy's not just a tough first mate, he's royalty in denial. Once you accept that, black blades stop being mysterious collectibles and start looking like long-term conquerors' projects. Yoru is Mihawk's completed thesis. Shusui is Ryuma's. So what's Zoro's endgame? One black blade would already put him in god-tier company. But this is Zoro we're talking about. The man who collects cursed swords like their keychains. I want to emphasize how insane it would be if he forges not just Enma into a black blade, but Wado Ichimonji as well. Kozaburo's good and demon children both turn jet black under the same heir's will. Maybe even Sandai Kitetsu too, just to complete the I domesticated every problem sword achievement. At that point, world's strongest swordsman stops meaning highest attack stat and starts meaning the guy whose will permanently subjugated the most blades. How many separate consciousnesses can you harmonize without losing yourself? How many kings can live in one king? And if Zoro turns 3 different problem children into black blades, what exactly is he evolving into while he's busy evolving them? The One-Eyed King, Sight Sacrifice, and Zoro's final perception upgrade. At a certain point, you realize One Piece is just Oda doing increasingly weird things with eyeballs. We've got gods, kings, and the world's sharpest birdman all weaponizing the act of looking at stuff, and Zoro's like, cool, I'll just stop using one. Because as far as visual motifs go, the series quietly built a whole hierarchy of sight. Odin gouges out his eye for wisdom. Imu sits on the empty throne framed by that single, alien, vertical stare. And Mihawk's literal hawk eyes are treated like a targeting system for eras. Who defines the age? The one who sees furthest, or sees what no one else can. And to be fair, Oda is not subtle about this. He just buries it under fart jokes and Luffy faceplants. So where does Zoro's stitched-shut eye fit into that pantheon of cursed contact lenses? Here's an interesting thing. The fandom defaulted to, oh, he lost the eye off-screen, lazy, to which I say, mate, you're a rushed system, because narratively that's the least interesting option. Zoro is the guy who trains with the world's greatest observational predator and comes back having voluntarily turned off 50% of his basic vision. That feels less like an accident and more like a trade. I want to emphasize this. The sacrifice isn't about blindness, it's about rerouting. Zoro already fights by feeling killing intent, reading steel, and bathing in hockey pressure like it's a hot spring. Post-time skip, his battlefield awareness jumps in a way that doesn't track with, I'm half blind now. It tracks with, I don't need mundane sight to parse threats anymore. He's basically telling the universe, keep your depth perception, I'll use Conqueror's Wi-Fi. That sets up 3 main payoff routes, all of which are actually pretty elegant. Option 1. The eye is just never opened. Permanent handicap. The point is that Zoro became the world's greatest while consciously nerfing himself, mirroring Mihawk's early handicap against Kid Zoro. Power through limitation, not a secret Sharingan. Option 2. It's a sealed hockey mode, not a laser beam, but a state where his perception spikes into something closer to future sight, or even that creepy sword god presence Ryuma had. When it opens, the art goes negative, sound drops out, and suddenly every blade on the field is answering him. Option 3 is the theatrical one. Oda times the reveal for the Mihawk rematch, not as a cheap switch, eye open, stats doubled, but as a visual metaphor that Zoro has finally caught up to the way Mihawk sees the world. 2 one-eyed kings facing off, both having sacrificed ordinary vision for absolute clarity of purpose. Whichever route he takes, the eye is the last big visual metaphor Oda's kept in reserve for Zoro. It's not a button, it's a verdict. This is the man who no longer just cuts what's in front of him. He understands what should and shouldn't be cut. And if that sounds grandiose, good, because next we need to talk about what happens when that perception is aimed not at a swordsman, but at the world itself. Zoro versus Mihawk versus the world. Why their rematch is bigger than a duel. When Zoro finally looks past the thing in front of him and aims that judgment at the world, the first neck on the chopping block isn't random. It's Mihawk's. And that duel is not just round 2 with the cool bird guy. It's basically a referendum on who's allowed to define what a swordsman even is. We talk about Mihawk like he's Zoro's personal mountain, to which I say, he kind of is, but he's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site sponsored by the world government. World's Strongest Swordsman isn't just a flex. It's a title the current era has quietly agreed to respect. Marines, warlords, even Yonko-tier monsters treat it as a real rank in the global power system, not just some dude's Twitter bio. As far as the old world is concerned, Mihawk is the finished product, the end of the line. And here's an interesting thing. Look at who else is sitting at the top with legendary blades. Gorosei like Saturn with his cursed-looking sword, the bald one with that classic katana, Gandhi Gorosei with Shodai Kitetsu if the theory holds. These are not just old guys with cool toys. They're the board of directors for legalized violence. Their whole vibe is control, hierarchy, sanctioned killing wrapped in order. Mihawk, even as a free agent, still fits that philosophy. One throne, one peak, one man above all others. So when we say Zoro beats Mihawk one day, we're actually poking a stick at the foundation. If Zoro surpasses the man the era crowned, that win doesn't stay in a little rivalry box. Symbolically, and probably literally, it hands him the authority to point his swords upward at the people who built the rankings in the first place. You don't become the new world's strongest swordsman and then just not have beef with the sword-wielding rulers of the world. That's like becoming Pirate King and being allergic to poneglyphs. I want to emphasize that rematch is not who cuts cleaner, Hawkeye or Cyclops. It's a clash of sword philosophies. Mihawk is the solitary throne, a man who perfected himself by cutting himself away from everyone else. Zoro's whole thing, especially post-Wano King of Hell Zoro, is being a king among equals, standing next to Luffy, Sanji, Jinbe, not above them. His strength exists to lift a crew, a captain, eventually a whole era. And to be fair, Mihawk isn't evil. That's what makes this so sharp. He represents the best possible version of a world that still believes in fixed hierarchies. Zoro represents a world where the strongest swordsman can walk into Maria Joie, look at a Gorosei blade, and say, "No, you don't get to decide who lives and dies anymore." Because as far as the story is concerned, Zoro versus Mihawk is the dress rehearsal. The real question is, once Zoro wins that crown, what does he cut with it first? The symbol or the system behind it? The right hand of Joy Boy, Zoro's place in the final prophecy. So if Zoro versus Mihawk is the dress rehearsal, the main event is something way bigger and way weirder. Zoro as the right hand of Joy Boy. We keep talking about Luffy like he's this singular messiah figure, but you don't stage a world-scale revolution with one rubber guy and vibes. You need a sun, and you need a sword. By Wano, Oda has basically put a giant neon sign over Luffy that says, "Hi, I'm Joy Boy." The drum of liberation, the Nika silhouette, the literal sun god laughter fruit, even the way the world reacts in terror to his awakening. The text is not subtle. So if Luffy is the returning sun hero, what does that make the man who literally swore to never lose again so that the future Pirate King's dream could live? Because as far as narrative structure goes, your protagonist's first mate is not just a roommate with AB muscles. Here's an interesting thing. In a lot of myths, the radiant hero is paired with a war god or a death king. Sun and storm. Life and the guy who makes sure your enemies stop having it. Zoro calling himself the King of Hell in Wano is not just edgy album cover branding. It slots cleanly into that pattern. Joy Boy opens the gate. The King of Hell stands in the doorway and asks, "Okay, who still wants to fight this?" And to be fair, Oda's been quietly building that vibe forever. Shimotsuki Village is literally an illegal Wano offshoot founded by Kozaburo. the guy who forged both Wado Ichimonji and Enma. Ryuma, the sword god, looks like Zoro's ancestor in a bad cosplay wig. Zoro manifests Conqueror's haki, coats his blades in it, and then declares he'll become the king of hell while wielding a sword that once scarred Kaido. This is not a background character. This is the enforcer of an era. People say, "Isn't Joy Boy about liberation, not execution?" To which I say, tell that to the celestial dragons when their palace is on fire. Joy Boy's will isn't just everyone be free, it's this oppressive system dies. Someone has to actually swing on the symbols of that old world. Zoro's cursed swords, the black blade foreshadowing, the one-eyed death god imagery all scream that he's the guy who cuts the final stubborn threads. I want to emphasize how practical that makes him in the prophecy. Luffy's fights are increasingly symbolic. Sun god versus darkness, freedom versus fate. Zoro's endgame is going to be disgustingly concrete. Think my hawk as the last test, then Gorosei sword monsters, maybe even cutting down a god bodyguarding Imu. While Luffy rings the bell that tells the world it's free, Zoro is in the back rooms making sure no one with a sacred blade and a superiority complex can quietly undo it. So when the final war hits, watch how often the camera cuts from Luffy changing the sky to Zoro changing the casualty list. Joy Boy brings the dawn. The King of Hell guards the border between that dawn and the darkness trying to crawl back in. The hidden theme, Zoro as the will that refuses to bow. Joy Boy can open the gate, but Zoro is the guy standing in the doorway, refusing to move. And that sounds like basic hype poster stuff until you actually track his story and realize his whole character is built around one very specific crime in the One Piece world. He refuses to bow. Go all the way back to Kid Zoro challenging grown men in that dojo. He knows he's outclassed, he loses constantly, but he never once tries to win by begging, only by cutting. That's the same kid who looks up at Mihawk, the single worst matchup in the East Blue, gets absolutely demolished, and still chooses to lose standing, blade raised, never showing his back. People like to say, well, he bowed when he asked Mihawk to train him. To which I say, no, he didn't bow to Mihawk's power. He bowed to his own dream. He'd rather kneel to the path he chose than to the fear that says, give up, be realistic. Because as far as the world government is concerned, that attitude is a bug in the system. Their whole thing runs on fear, compromise, and paperwork. You pay your celestial dragon tax. You shut up about the void century. You trade your dream for survival and call it justice. Even the good Marines are constantly told to pick their battles, look away, file the atrocity under classified. Zoro's ethos is the exact opposite operating system. He will literally die before he signs that user agreement. Look at Thriller Bark. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't try to split the pain. He just says, give it all to me. That's not loyalty as a cute character trait. That's a philosophical stance. Better I break than the dream breaks. Same in Wano, standing in front of Kaido's blast, or facing death a dozen times over for people he could have easily written off. He treats the concept of limit the way he treats walls. Something you cut. And here's an interesting thing. Every weird lore thread we've talked about is just a costume change for that same idea. Cursed swords that try to control their wielder? He doesn't purify them. He outstubborns them. Enma literally yanks his haki out of his body, and he goes, fine, then I'll just grow more. Black blades that are forged through endless battle. That's the world admitting that Zoro's unbending will can permanently rewrite steel. Conqueror's haki, one eye closed, Shimotsuki blood, King of Hell title. These aren't separate mysteries, they're all ways of saying, this guy does not accept externally imposed ceilings. The government says bloodline determines your place. Zoro takes a maybe Shimotsuki lineage and uses it as kindling, not a cage. Mihawk's title says strongest in the world. Zoro treats it as a promise, not a warning label. I want to emphasize that's why he's uniquely suited to be the world's greatest swordsman in the era Luffy is trying to create. In a world built on submission, the strongest blade has to belong to the man who simply doesn't recognize the legitimacy of chains. And if that's true, then the real final question isn't, can Zoro beat Mihawk? It's, what happens when that unbending will finally swings at the last taboo the world still thinks can't be cut? How these theories change. Reading Zoro forever. So once you accept Zoro as future King of Hell, who maybe descends from a sword god and lives in an illegal Wano colony, you kind of can't watch the series the same way again. The story hasn't changed, but the operating system in your head absolutely has. Go back to East Blue with this in mind. Shimotsuki Village stops being a random dojo backdrop and starts looking like witness protection for an exiled samurai clan. Every quiet scene of Kid Zoro training under Koshiro now reads like a Wano heir being very politely nerfed. When he swears to surpass Kuina, we're not just watching a rivalry. We're watching the last branch of a fallen family accidentally reboot Ryuma's legacy in a backwater sea that was never supposed to matter. And to be fair, that's very funny and very Oda. Alabasta, run the Mr. One fight again. Zoro unlocking cut steel isn't just a shonen power-up. It's the prototype moment for cut what the world says is impossible. If his endgame is literally slicing through the last taboo, this is the tutorial level. Watch how Oda frames Wado Ichimonji in that fight. Lingering panels, that clean white scabbard against rubble, the way it's always the sword in his hand when he has a breakthrough. Knowing Kozaburo forged both Wado and Enma, that visual favoritism suddenly looks like long-term engineering, not a vague aesthetic choice. Here's an interesting thing when you rewatch Thriller Bark. The nothing happened scene already lives rent-free in our brains, but under the King of Hell reading, it becomes Zoro's first real descent into the underworld. He doesn't just tank Luffy's pain. He quietly negotiates with something. The blood-soaked silhouette, the way the anime drops almost all sound, everyone's horrified reaction to his presence after. That plays like the moment a dormant conqueror finally brushes up against a boundary it's not supposed to cross. Sabaody and the first meeting with Mihawk also get upgraded. Previously, it's rival shows up, Zoro gets humbled. With these theories, you're watching the only confirmed Black Blade user look directly at a future Black Blade forger and go, "Yeah, that thing you're trying to become? I already am the test. Pay attention to eyes here. The hawk eyes, the single scarred eye we haven't seen open. The way Oda keeps putting circular focus shots on Zoro's face whenever he makes a world-shifting vow. Because, as far as visual foreshadowing goes, Oda is not subtle, we are just slow. Then Wano hits, and it's like the mask drops. Zoro's reaction to the samurai code, his instinctive rage at Orochi, the way Enma literally drags his haki out like it's trying to restore him to factory settings, all of that reads as a homecoming story he doesn't remember he's in. When he takes the King of Hell title, that's not a meme line. That's a job application to whatever role Ryuma used to hold. I want to emphasize, None of this has to be spoiler truth to be useful. This is a reading mode. It's a way of treating every Zoro panel, every shot of his swords lined up, every offhand mention of Wano, every reaction shot when a god walks on stage, as part of a deliberate, decades-long construction. And if that's how we're reading him now, the real fun is asking what current background details are quietly setting up the last thing Zoro will ever cut. Where Zoro's story can still surprise us. So if every Zoro panel is a setup, that also means every gap in his story is a loaded gun sitting on Oda's desk. And with Zoro, the gaps are loud. We're not just waiting on, will he beat my hawk? We're sitting on a pile of unresolved boss fight side quests. First, lineage. We know Shimotsuki village is literally named after a Wano clan. Kozaburo bailed out of Wano and founded it, and he forged both Wado and Enma. Easiest reading, Zoro is basically a Shimotsuki, maybe a direct descendant, which ties him into Wano's lost daimyo drama. That fits Oda's style because as far as family reveals go, he likes clean, emotionally simple payoffs. Your sword and your soul came from the same place. The overreach version is, Zoro is Ryuma reincarnated, secret prince of Wano, and also the chosen avatar of the sword god. To which I say, calm down, he still gets lost in a straight hallway. Then the eye. The grounded option is that it's just an injury, a Mihawk training scar that visually marks the time skip. That's very Oda. Big symbolism, small explanation. But here's an interesting thing. He keeps emphasizing eyes for godlike figures, Emu's close-up, Mihawk's hawk eyes, the one-eyed lore around Odin myths. So the spicier version is that Zoro's left eye is a sealed perception power, some advanced haki or Asura-adjacent state he literally can't control yet. Cool? Yes. Guaranteed? No. If Oda ever opens that eye and it shoots out a laser, we all have to apologize to the edgy AMV crowd. Black blades are almost safer ground because we have rules. They're forged through battle. Mihawk's Yoru is our only confirmed one, and Ryuma's Shusui was the prototype. Zoro turning Enma into a black blade is basically locked. It's the clean narrative upgrade. The question is, does he stop at one, or does he go full 3 black blades, endgame monster? 3 is peak fan wish fulfillment and kind of breaks the rarity. But 1 feels almost too modest for the guy called King of Hell. And to be fair, Oda loves dangling that second black blade in history, phrasing like he's begging us to overthink it. Then the final bounty and title. World's strongest swordsman is obvious. The fun is how the world phrases the monster who stood next to Pirate King Luffy. Is he King of Hell Zoro? Sword God? Right hand of the Pirate King? Or some combo monstrosity that makes bounty posters a graphic design nightmare? Does his bounty brush up against Yonko levels, or does Oda keep him numerically under Luffy to preserve the hierarchy? All of this sits on a bigger tension. Is Zoro just the world's most dedicated Jimbro with swords, or is he a lore singularity connecting Wano, gods, and endgame prophecy? I want to emphasize that Oda might intentionally keep him half-explained. The moment you fully systemize Zoro, lineage chart, eye manual, black blade count, prophecy footnote, you risk losing the mystique of guy who simply cuts what shouldn't be cut. So the play here isn't to wait for one giant Zoro info dump. It's to treat every SBS answer, every offhand bounty mention, every new sword name as a data point in a long-running Zoro meta-mystery. Because as far as we can tell, Oda is drip-feeding us just enough to build patterns without ever closing the case. And if that's true, then the real question isn't who is Zoro, actually. But how much deeper can this rabbit hole go before the final Mihawk clash forces Oda to pick a version of him and lock it in? Your turn in the dojo. Final takeaways and what to watch next, which is kind of the perfect place to land this, because if Zoro is a walking meta-mystery, then we've basically been training in his dojo for the last 2 hours. So, rapid fire, what did we actually build here? We've got Zoro as a probable Shimotsuki heir from an illegal Wano export village, spiritual successor to Ryuma, the literal sword god, the guy who keeps picking up cursed blades like they're on clearance, the future black blade forger who might stand next to Mihawk as the only other person to pull that off, a hidden conqueror who only recently stopped pretending to be a normal fighter, a one-eyed perception monster, and the right hand of Joy Boy in a world that really wants to pretend he's just the Swordsman. That's a lot of job titles for someone allegedly built to say, "Luffy, don't die," and then pass out. And I want to emphasize the contrarian thing we've been quietly screaming the whole time. Zoro is not just the number 2 on the boat. He's a lore keystone. His story quietly underpins Wano's lost history, the cursed blade economy, the Ryuma mythology, the black blade system, and even how Conqueror's haki visually works when it's running through steel. People like to say he's simple, to which I say, sure, if your idea of simple is, what if Odin, a samurai demigod, and the concept of loyalty fused and started doing crunches? Here's an interesting thing. If you rewatch Thriller Bark, Shimotsuki Village, and Wano with this in mind, it stops feeling like Zoro is tagging along on Luffy's destiny and starts feeling like Joy Boy accidentally recruited a localized endgame boss as his vice captain. Because as far as narrative power goes, the guy who tames cursed swords, forges black blades, and literally calls himself King of Hell is not a side character, he's a thematic co-pillar. So now it's your turn in the dojo. Drop your Zoro theories in the comments. Shimotsuki heir or red herring? Is the missing eye a Mihawk-style perception upgrade, a sealed power? Or did he just lose a bet and commit too hard to the bit? Does he forge his black blade before or during the Mihawk rematch? And to be fair, if you think all of this is overthinking and he's just strong swordsman man, say that too. Argue. Correct us. Call out the parts where the timeline is a vague mess. That back and forth is literally the point. If you want a next step, go hit the Mihawk deep dive we've got queued up, because that turns this whole dynamic into a teacher versus monster student horror story. Or jump into the Cursed Blades video and treat every Kaitetsu scene like a horror anthology about sentient steel. Then, re-watch your favorite Zoro episodes with all of this rattling around in your head and ask yourself, does this look like a side character? Or a hidden final boss Oda's been slow-rolling since Chapter 1?